Welcome to Lore to Snore, your new favorite place to fall asleep with stories. Before you drift off, tell us in the comments, which Family Guy character do you think hides the most pain behind their humor? We'd love to hear your sleepy theories. Now let's begin. In the quiet stillness of Spooner Street, while Quahog snores under the sleepy hum of streetlights, there's one bedroom where the shadows never quite sit still. If you pressed your ear to the door of the smallest room in the Griffin house just below the faded rainbow alphabet stickers and the half-forgotten baby monitor, you might hear a faint, tinny hum of electricity. Or maybe it's just your imagination. But step inside, past the plush carpet littered with colorful building blocks and suspiciously deconstructed teddy bears, and you'd see the truth. Stewie Griffin's lair is no ordinary nursery. Tonight the moon slides through the cracked blinds in thin silver bars, striping the carpet like a prison yard. Stewie lies in his crib, half buried under a blanket that's seen more dry runs at world domination than any military bunker in human history. His eyes, huge, bright, far too knowing for a child who should be babbling nonsense syllables, flick open, darting to the glowing edge of a hidden trapdoor by the toy chest. A soft click, a squeak of gears, and the floor lifts, just an inch, just enough. In the outside world, Stewie is a baby. His head is round and football-shaped. His voice squeaks when Lois is near. But here in his lair, the lair that isn't a lair if Lois asks, he is supreme commander, architect of tomorrow, inventor of yesterday, and the only diapered dictator who double-checks if Rupert, his loyal teddy bear, has heard every monologue. Rupert always has. Rupert doesn't judge. Rupert's soft button eyes see all, keep all. Stewie slides from crib to floor with a practiced wiggle, landing with a faint thump on a stuffed bunny that muffles his escape. He drags a plush duck aside to pull open a floor panel, a hidden tunnel no one knows about except Brian, the only creature in the house who sometimes sees the secret midnight shows. Under the floor, the tunnel glows a dull blue, lined with scribbled blueprints taped to cheap plywood. Stewie has drawn it all himself, laser scribbles, half-built rocket parts, childish doodles of himself perched on top of a crumbling Capitol building. The drawings smudge at the edges where tiny fingers with sticky juice box residue have left their mark. Tonight's mission is no different than any other. Expand the plan, refine the blueprint, whisper the promise of tomorrow's chaos to the only bear who'll listen. Stewie crawls inside the tunnel, dragging Rupert by one fuzzy arm. The bear's ear flops against the blueprint, brushing a line of childish scrawl. Phase 2, tiny death ray. He stops, adjusts Rupert so the bear can see the plan. It's very important Rupert sees. Otherwise, what's the point? If you listen close enough, you'd hear Stewie muttering under his breath words far too big for bedtime stories. Soon, my dear Rupert, very soon, this entire household shall tremble under my tiny thumb. First the household, then the neighborhood, then the entirety of this repulsive suburban microcosm, and finally the planet itself. But hush now. Baby steps, Rupert, baby steps. Behind him, the nursery hums its half-innocent lullaby. The mobile above the crib spins lazily, moons and stars bobbing in gentle defiance of Stewie's private night shift. On the shelf above the changing table sits a baby monitor. Its little red light flickers every few seconds. Lois never notices. Peter's snoring would drown out a small nuclear blast anyway, so the lair remains secret. The mission remains safe. He crawls deeper into his crawl-space knees, squeaking on the plastic mat. Around him, the walls close in with soft giggles of old stuffed animals who didn't survive their conversion to secret listening devices. A plush giraffe with one button eye. A headless teddy bear that hums static when you press its foot. All trophies, all tools. In Stewie's world, nothing cuddly is safe from a little creative repurposing. Sometimes, if Brian stumbles in on these late-night escapades, there's a polite bark and an eye roll, the dog's half-amused, half-worried look that only Stewie ever sees. But tonight, Brian's asleep by the couch, tangled in Peter's discarded snack wrappers. That means it's just Stewie and Rupert, a perfect duo for a perfect plot. In the far corner of the tunnel, a bigger blueprint glows under a small clip-on reading lamp. Crayons, scattered like rainbow confetti, mark every corner of Stewie's mind. There's a page for every plan. A time machine scribbled in crooked lines, a mind control helmet that looks suspiciously like an upside-down salad bowl with wires glued on. A doodle of Brian wearing said helmet with big X's for eyes. In Stewie's imagination, the whole family is exactly where he needs them under control, on script, never scolding him for spilling juice on the rug again. Stewie sits cross-legged now, plops Rupert in his lap, and flips a switch on a toy walkie-talkie that's definitely not just a toy. A faint static crackles. He clears his throat. The baby who says "mommy" with syrupy sweetness in the daylight now growls into his command mic with the gravitas of an evil mastermind. Operation Sleepy Suburb is ahead of schedule, Rupert. Soon the grown-ups shall pay for their insipid babble, their ceaseless demands for nap-time compliance. I shall be free to dine on cookies at 3 a.m, watch late-night cinema of questionable rating, and he pauses, eyes flicking to the ceiling, as if Lois might appear in a puff of mom-scented soap bubbles. And perhaps we'll keep them around a bit longer. For chores, of course. Rupert, true to form, says nothing. Stewie sighs, content with the echo of his own voice. He pats Rupert's fuzzy head. Yes, my good man. All in due time. Outside the tunnel, the Griffin house shifts in its sleep pipes gurgle. Peter snorts. Meg mutters something about being ignored, even in dreams. But down here, in this half-glowing belly of blueprints and half-baked evil, Stewie Griffin is master of his world. Tomorrow he'll coo for Lois. Tomorrow he'll giggle for Peter. But tonight, here in the shadows, he's the tiny tyrant plotting bedtime's biggest betrayal. And if the universe only knew what this baby dreams about when the nightlight flickers, well, it's probably better the universe gets to sleep too. But in the corners of that darkened mind palace, the gears were grinding towards something very uncharacteristic for Stewie Griffin introspection. As the digital clocks blinked lazily through the early hours of morning, Stewie lay wide awake in his crib. His eyes darted to the ceiling, tracing patterns in the dim glow of his galactic projector, which painted slowly shifting constellations above him like a planetarium had crash-landed on Sesame Street. Rupert, ever the silent sentinel, sat propped beside him with the same vacant, button-eyed stare. But to Stewie, Rupert was more than cotton and stitching. He was a sounding board, a witness, a co-conspirator. If teddy bears had a loyalty ranking, Rupert would be in MI6. And tonight, he was about to be briefed. I don't know what's wrong with me, Rupert, Stewie murmured, one arm behind his head, the other lazily cradling a half-eaten, teething biscuit like a cigar. Today, during Meg's miserable rendition of a musical about photosynthesis, I almost felt bad for her. Rupert naturally offered no objection. Not bad in the usual way, like when someone is trampled by a rhinoceros after mocking me at a birthday party. Stewie continued, his voice dropping lower as if the emotional weight might cause Lois to peer in. No, bad like empathy, disgusting, vile empathy. There was a beat of silence as the nightlight flickered just slightly, casting a shifting halo over Rupert's stitched smile. Am I becoming soft? Stewie asked aloud. The word soft left his lips like a curse, and he sat up abruptly, sending his bib flying to the floor. No, perish the thought. I'm a machine of precision, an apex strategist. I once built a death ray from Duplo blocks and a hairdryer. He crawled to the edge of the crib and stared through the bars as if they were the only thing keeping him from spiraling into emotional chaos. The camera of our imagination pans downward to the floor, where the chalkboard diagrams of a new invention lay scattered among binkies and cereal crumbs. At the top of one sketch, emotion suppression, helmet V1, 0. Rupert, we must take action, Stewie declared, fire returning to his eyes, before I start rescuing kittens or, heaven forbid, asking Brian how he's doing. Rupert was swiftly strapped to Stewie's back like a plush Yoda as our tiny mastermind lowered himself out of the crib using a pulley system made from pacifier strings and shoelaces. The stealth with which he operated could shame any Navy SEAL. Lois, Peter, even Brian, passed out from box wine, slept undisturbed. Within seconds, Stewie was crawling through the hallway like a baby with purpose, his red overalls softly swishing as he slid past family photos in an ominously flickering nightlight. He stopped only briefly to grimace at a framed photo of Peter in a toga, then shuddered and moved on. Down in the basement, the real lair awaited, hidden behind a faux washing machine panel that swung open like the Bat Cave, only with more finger paint and fewer bats. Lights hummed to life, casting a soft blue glow over tools, wires, and prototypes that would make Tony Stark weep. "Welcome to the womb of genius," Stewie whispered dramatically, his voice echoing as the computer console booted up. On the wall, a screen blinked on and displayed a data graph that looked suspiciously like a mood chart from a teen girl's diary. "You see this, Rupert?" he said, gesturing to a sharp spike labeled confused warmth during Meg's solo. "This is unacceptable. Emotion must be contained, bottled, frozen like my juice pops." He clicked open a design schematic, a helmet with wires and a screen that read Emo Zapper 5000. A small red sticker on the drawing said, "Patent pending, Griffin Industries." But as he pulled tools from drawers little more than modified baby spoons and teething rings with circuitry, his hands hesitated. He glanced at Rupert again, and something stirred behind his cartoonishly large eyes. "What if," he paused, "what if the emotions are part of the process? Now, if this were a different show, say, one involving singing princesses or pastel ponies, this would be the moment Stewie embraced the magic of feelings and broke into a song about vulnerability. But this is Family Guy, and instead, Stewie slapped himself lightly and muttered, "No! Focus!" Cue dramatic montage music as he worked through the night. Wires twisted, sparks flew, and the screen lit up with bar graphs of emotional readings. The Emo Zapper 5000 took shape, albeit with a pacifier sticking out of one side like a power lever. And through it all, Rupert watched silently, a sage-like presence in the lab of a mad baby scientist waging war on his own humanity. As dawn crept in and soft pink light began filtering through the laundry chute vent, Stewie stepped back, wiping sweat or drool from his brow. "There," he said, holding up the helmet like Rafiki presenting Simba. "The key to purging these soft, squishy brain hiccups. No more feelings. No more guilt when Brian drinks himself into a poetry spiral. No more sympathy when Meg's talent show ends in crying and burnt papier-mâché." But just as he prepared to place the helmet on his head, something curious happened. Rupert tipped over. It wasn't dramatic, just a gentle flop to the side. But Stewie's eyes widened as if he'd just witnessed an assassination. "Rupert? Oh, my God, Rupert." He rushed over, forgetting the helmet entirely, lifting the bear gently like a wounded comrade. He checked the stitches, the fluff, even sniffed the bear for the familiar scent of vanilla baby powder and conspiracy. You scared me, old friend, he whispered. Don't you ever do that again. He held Rupert close for a moment longer than he usually allowed himself. And there it was again. Emotion. That slippery, aggravating, terrifying thing. But this time, Stewie didn't run from it. He didn't build a laser or trap it in a bottle or whisper Latin hexes under his breath. He just sat, quietly, holding the one thing in the world that had never judged him, even when his evil plans went hilariously sideways. Maybe just for today, Rupert, he murmured. We won't suppress the feelings. We'll study them. Then slowly, like a drowsy robot powering down, he climbed back into his crib with Rupert and curled under his blanket. The emo zapper. 5,000 blinked quietly on the lab bench, unused for now. And thus, the first thread of the emotional tapestry began to pull loose. Sleep never comes easily to minds like Stewie's not truly. Even as his eyelids fluttered closed and his breath fell into soft rhythms, the circuitry of his subconscious was running diagnostics, probing questions no infant should ask in their dreams. And somewhere in the dead center of that REM cycle, reality folded. A sharp beep sliced the quiet. Then another. A high-pitched whine, mechanical, unsettling. Stewie's brow twitched. Rupert shifted slightly beneath his arm as if aware that something unnatural had entered their bubble of stillness. The dreamscape twisted. Gone were the floating mobiles and soft stars in their place. Endless lines of code scrolled across walls of darkness. A voice, sterile and cold, broke through. Emotion detected. Compassion. Response, anomaly. Stewie jolted upright in his crib. Except this wasn't his crib. Everything was off. The bars were higher, the colors were faded. The nursery mobile above him spun unnaturally fast, its plastic moons and stars stretching like time-lapse footage. The air was thick, humming with static. Rupert? Stewie croaked, his voice trembling with unfamiliarity. He looked down. The bear was gone. His fingers gripped only pale blue cotton sheets, wrinkled and cold. Suddenly, the mobile stopped spinning and dropped. Wham! It crashed inches from Stewie's face, embedding itself into the mattress like a thrown weapon. His instincts kicked in years, or months technically, of preparing for home invasions, nanny coups, and parallel universe breaches weren't going to waste. He somersaulted out of the crib with surprising grace, landing on the spongy floor tiles just as the room's lights flickered. But there was no basement, no lab, no access to his gear. The door across the room creaked open. A long, thin shadow spilled in. It wasn't Lois. It wasn't anyone he recognized. A deep, resonant hum began pulsing through the room, almost like a heart monitor layered beneath orchestral strings. The shadow stepped forward. It was himself, but not a version he'd ever met. This Stewie was taller, not by much, but enough to unsettle. His head was slightly warped, oblong, and scarred, as if he'd survived some terrible invention gone wrong. His eyes glowed faintly blue, and a cracked version of the emo zapper helmet pulsed on his head like a crown. Hello, me, the figure said, his voice a perfect blend of mockery and warmth. You're not supposed to feel. That was never part of the plan. Stewie backed away slowly, his heartbeat in his ears. You're from the future. Not quite. The doppelganger smiled. I'm from a future, one of many. A strand that formed the moment you chose Rupert over the helmet. No, this is a dream, Stewie whispered. You're not real. This isn't... The other Stewie stepped closer, eyes burning now. Your subconscious summoned me. Every emotion you've repressed built me. I'm not an invader. I'm the result. Suddenly, the walls cracked outward with a sound like screaming glass. The nursery peeled apart, revealing an endless, spiraling corridor of infinite versions of himself, each imprisoned behind translucent walls like exhibits in a museum of madness. One sobbing into a pillow, one convulsing with laughter, one screaming, teeth clenched, pounding against the walls. These are your discarded emotions, future Stewie said, sweeping his hand out like a magician, revealing a trick. You thought you could bottle them up, bury them, build around them, but they grew, they evolved, and now they won out. No, Stewie muttered, clenching his tiny fists. You're just guilt, a byproduct. You're nothing but a threat. Future Stewie grinned, glitching slightly. Let me show you what happens when one of these versions breaks free. The corridor began to rumble. Lights burst, one wall cracked. And then chaos. One of the imprisoned versions, a Stewie sobbing and twitching, burst through the wall like a banshee, teeth bared, eyes wild. It lunged for our Stewie, shrieking a soundless cry of anguish. Stewie ran. Feet slapping the floor, dodging glass-like debris, he raced down the corridor of emotional doppelgangers, each clawing at their prisons, their hands grazing the walls, crying out fragments of lines he'd heard in real life. Why doesn't Brian ever hug me back? Why does Peter never notice me? Why did Lois stop singing to me at bedtime? It wasn't just terrifying, it was true. He turned a corner sharply and skidded into a small chamber, this one calm, unnervingly sterile. In its center stood the Emo Zapper 5000. Pristine, untouched. Use it? The voice echoed again, this time from inside his head. Just put it on. Zap it all away. He hesitated. His hand hovered over the dial, marked with words like shame, anger, loneliness, and in tiny font at the very end, love. Choose, the voice urged. Choose or be overrun. Suddenly, the screaming Stewies flooded the corridor behind him like a wave. One tripped, then the others spilled through, their emotions now fully unchained, a visual tsunami of unprocessed trauma. Stewie turned to the helmet. His fingers brushed loneliness. But then he heard something. Soft. Familiar. Stewie? It was Lois. Real distant, muffled, like a mother calling from outside the door in the waking world. The dream began to destabilize. The corridor melted. The cries faded. And Stewie shot up in his crib, soaked in sweat, gasping. Rupert lay by his side, unmoved. Sunlight trickled through the blinds. Lois opened the door, poking her head in. Good morning, sweetie. Did you sleep okay? He blinked at her, face pale. Yes, fine. Peachy. As she walked away, he turned to Rupert. I think I just battled my own psychological shadow army in a dream. Rupert, as always, said nothing. But Stewie's hand trembled as he pulled the blanket up and noticed something strange. On the floor, just beneath the crib, was a crumpled piece of paper. It was a drawing of the Emo Zapper 5000. But he hadn't drawn it. Stewie held the drawing like it was evidence at a crime scene. The paper was worn, creased, with jagged edges like it had been torn from a larger blueprint. But the lines were unmistakable, a clean, almost architectural sketch of Emo Zapper 5000, labeled neatly in crimson crayon as if drafted during a fit of clarity by a tiny lunatic with too much time and not enough therapy. And at the bottom corner, there it was, a signature, but not his. It read only S.G. Prime. Stewie stared at it, heart thumping. This wasn't a game. This wasn't some leftover from last week's multiversal misadventure or a weird Brian prank. Someone, some version of him, was trying to reach out, to push him, to trigger something. He flipped the paper over. There was more. Just 4 words. Build it or break. He slid off the crib and tiptoed across the nursery, crumpling the page in his palm. The sun outside was innocent, radiant, suburban peace incarnate. But it meant nothing. Stewie knew better than anyone. Danger never announced itself in daylight. It slithered in silence, waited, lingered. And now it had a name. Prime. Down in the basement lab, Stewie began pulling covers off his older inventions. The ones he swore off, the ones Brian once convinced him to decommission after that incident with the mind-swap toaster. Each piece was dustier than the last, but his fingers moved with purpose. Not because he believed in the helmet, not yet, but because someone was manipulating the edges of his perception. And Stewie Griffin did not tolerate being outplayed. The more he looked at the crumpled schematic, the more details revealed themselves. Hidden layers, cross-sections, even scribbled notes, in a handwriting that was his, but older, sharper, more emotionally detached. It wasn't just a helmet. It was an extraction device. Stewie muttered to himself, scanning lines. Modular emotional siphon port. Neural bypass to suppress trauma echo. Failsafe trigger. Empathy threshold breach. This wasn't a weapon. It was a filter. A method for dividing himself, separating emotion from intention. But the terrifying question loomed larger with every adjustment he made to the prototype. Why had another Stewie built this? And what had happened when he used it? The moment Stewie finished soldering the last circuit, the house seemed quieter. Too quiet, even for Sunday. He climbed back upstairs, only to find the living room empty. Peter wasn't watching TV. Lois wasn't in the kitchen. Even Brian was nowhere to be found. Only Chris stood by the window, completely still. "Oi, dummy," Stewie said, frowning. "Where is everyone?" Chris didn't answer. His mouth was slightly open, but his eyes were glazed, like he'd seen something massive and terrifying, or nothing at all. A void. Stewie stepped closer and saw something glinting behind Chris's ear. A tiny chrome patch, barely larger than a grain of rice, pulsing with faint blue light. A neural dampener. "No," Stewie whispered, the realization crashing into him like a freight train. It wasn't just a dream. It wasn't just about him. Someone Prime was already here, already pulling levers, and now, clearly, testing control methods on his family. Before he could act, the lights cut out, and then flickered back. Only for a second, but the TV came on by itself. Black screen. White text. "Stop building. You've been warned." He stared at it, the silence ringing in his ears. Then the TV exploded in static. "Blood!" Chris flinched violently, suddenly gasping like he'd surfaced from deep underwater. "Stewie? Where am I? Why is it so loud?" "Shh." Stewie grabbed his arm. "No time. Something's hijacking the neural resonance of this timeline. We're under siege." Chris blinked. "You mean like we're having visitors?" "No, you oversized man-child. I mean someone is altering cognition itself. A rogue version of me, Prime, has found a way to override thought. He's baiting me." Chris stared at him. "Do I still get cereal?" Stewie ignored him. This had gone far enough. He bolted back to the lab. If Prime was serious about stopping him, it meant only one thing. He was close to uncovering the truth. And the helmet, as terrifying as it was, held the key. Not because it offered control, but because it might reveal the hidden fractures in his own psyche that Prime was exploiting. He strapped it on. The emo zapper's interface blinked to life, humming like a living thing. Buttons lit up with soft pulses. The dial at its core awaited his selection. Anger, fear, sadness, attachment, love. He hovered over love again. A shiver crawled up his spine. If he activated it even partially, he'd feel everything. Or nothing. He took a breath and turned the dial to fear. The machine hissed. The lights dimmed. And suddenly the walls around him breathed. For a second, only a second, he saw it all, like a floodlight cast into his mind's deepest cave. Lois holding Meg, but turning her back on him. Brian walking away during a fight. Peter laughing at him, never with him. Every birthday, every bedtime, every moment of vulnerability he'd suppressed, all of it replayed at once. His legs buckled. Tears streamed down without permission. He wasn't ready. But the helmet had already started the process. And far above, in a place far outside the constraints of time or dimension, Prime Stewie smiled, watching through surveillance nodes stitched into the fabric of the multiverse. Let him feel. Let him shatter. Then we rebuild. The tears hadn't even dried when Stewie tore the helmet off. The lab lights hummed gently like the walls were trying to pretend none of it had happened. But his chest told a different story, tight, seizing, pulsing with every emotion that had once been neatly shelved like dusty encyclopedias in the attic of his psyche. He sank to the floor, breath itching. That hadn't been fear. It had been a floodgate. But that wasn't what terrified him. What terrified him was how good it had felt. For a moment, to feel something fully. The clarity. A sudden honesty with himself. He had seen his childhood not as a genius, not as a manipulator, not as an overlord in training. He saw it as a child. One who had been abandoned, overlooked, and hurt. Stewie clutched at the helmet, still warm. "Of course," he whispered, voice cracking. "That's what Prime wanted me to see. Not to break me, but to remind me why I built walls in the first place." Click. A light flickered in the corner. Then another. The monitors in his lab blinked to life on their own, even the ones he hadn't powered in weeks. All at once, they flooded with static, before resolving into something clearer. A face. His own. But older. Sharper. Eyes like cracked glass, glinting with intelligence honed past humanity. Dressed in a black uniform stitched with circuitry, Prime Stewie looked like the future had weaponized him. He didn't blink. "Hello, Stewart," Prime said with a smirk. "It's rude to reboot an interface and not send an RSVP. Stewie stood slowly, wiping at his cheek. "I see you've decided to break the fourth wall of my psyche," he muttered, glaring at the screens. "Hope you brought a mop." Prime's image flickered slightly, as if nodding in approval. "You felt it, didn't you?" Prime said, voice smoother than oil. "The fear, the original memory, the thing we buried back in timeline D7. You think you're the first of us to dig this deep? You think you were strong enough to manage this alone? Why are you here?" "To stop you from doing what I did," Prime replied, his smile dropping. "You're making the same mistakes, flirting with vulnerability, leaning into love. That helmet isn't a therapy tool, it's a trap. Every emotion you extract gets locked away, but it doesn't disappear, it festers." Stewie frowned. "Then why leave me the blueprint?" "Because this is how it always starts," Prime said simply. "A closed loop. A warning written in your own hand." you always ignore it. And then, you become me. The screens all shut off at once. Stewie was alone again, and not. The words echoed through the lab like static trapped in walls. You become me. He looked back at the helmet. The dial was still set to fear, but something had changed. A new option flickered into view. A sixth emotion that hadn't been there before. Regret. He stared at it, jaw tight. Was this his doing? Or Prime's tampering? Either way, the device was evolving with him, and with each emotion extracted, the more externalized it became. As if the helmet wasn't just analyzing him, but recording him, turning fragments of his psyche into something separate, something autonomous. He had to know more. Not just about the helmet, but about the Stewie on the screen, the one who looked at him like a future he hadn't consented to. He needed data. Later that night, the Griffin household was unusually silent. Lois had gone to bed early. Peter was passed out face first in an empty pizza box. Meg was likely sobbing into a blog post somewhere upstairs. Brian, surprisingly, was nowhere to be found. Stewie crept down the hallway with the helmet slung in one hand and a notebook in the other. His tiny footsteps made no sound. His mind, however, was a blizzard. He had theories now. Prime wasn't trying to destroy him. He was trying to shape him. It was worse. It meant everything he'd seen, every flicker of fear or love or sadness the helmet unboxed wasn't meant to paralyze. It was meant to purge. Prime wanted a Stewie who could dominate the multiverse without the distractions of empathy or weakness. And this helmet was the funnel. But what if Stewie used it not to suppress, but to decode? He returned to the lab, flipped the helmet over, and began rewiring. No more single emotion settings, no more one-note extractions. He wanted to stack them, to overlap them, to see what happened when a mind confronted two truths at once. It was risky. It was brilliant. And it was exactly what Prime would hate. The test was set. Stewie sat in a chair, helmet recalibrated. This time the dial let him select dual inputs. He hesitated, then turned the dial to sadness, regret. It clicked. The lights dimmed. The world folded inward. Suddenly, he wasn't in the lab. He was in a hospital room. Faint beeping, white sheets, a crib, a window. A woman's face, not Lois's, a nurse. And then he saw her. His mother. Not Lois. The original one. The biological one. This was a memory long buried. She looked at him with guilt in her eyes, tears on her cheek. She whispered something he couldn't hear. And then she signed a document. Adoption papers. The pen trembled in her hand. Then silence. Stewie gasped, pulling himself back out of the vision. The helmet cracked slightly on one side. Sparks flew. The lab lights blinked violently. The origin of his displacement. It wasn't just neglect. It was abandonment. Stewie had always believed he was born into the Griffins, that he was cursed with idiocy as some divine punishment. But this changed the stakes. He hadn't belonged here. He'd been placed, and Prime knew all along. The helmet sparked in Stewie's lap, singed at the seams, the room still crackling with energy from the dual extraction run. His breath came in short, sharp stutters as he slowly pulled it off his head, fingertips trembling. A red welt throbbed along his temple, a side effect maybe. Or maybe the residue of what he'd just seen. That hospital room. The woman, the document. His origin wasn't what he'd been told, not what he'd chosen to believe. He wasn't born into this family. He was placed here, quietly, discreetly, like a puzzle piece jammed into a board that didn't match the picture. She gave me away, he muttered, blinking through the sting in his eyes. She didn't even look back. The words felt foreign in his mouth, soft, scared, human. He stumbled backward, hitting the console, clutching the desk for balance. The helmet clattered to the floor and rolled to a stop near Rupert, who sat slouched against the baseboard, one button eye cocked as if watching this unfold with quiet judgment. I thought I was born into chaos, Stewie whispered. I thought fate had cursed me with idiocy for parents. But I wasn't born into anything. I was delivered. A pre-packaged liability. Something discardable. He looked at Rupert. I'm not even sure if Lois knows. What if none of them know? The weight of that truth settled like concrete on his chest. He wasn't misunderstood by his family. He was a secret. A lie that had been folded into suburban life and left to rot behind the wallpaper of this house. He closed his eyes. The helmet's dual input setting had opened more than just emotional compartments. It had opened history. Real, buried history. Which meant Prime had seen this long ago, had been here, had felt this, and chose to erase it. No wonder Prime built a multiverse-sized firewall around his emotions. No wonder the helmet was a surgical tool and not a mirror. But Stewie wasn't Prime. Not yet. Hours passed. The lab returned to silence. Stewie sat alone on the floor, hugging his knees, watching the blank monitors like they might flicker to life again. He thought of Brian, not as a snarky sidekick, not as a drinking buddy, but as the only being who had ever listened to him without defaulting to diapers or dismissal. A dog, yes, but more human than most. And suddenly he needed to talk. Not to interrogate, not to test, just talk. He padded out of the lab quietly, clutching Rupert to his side like a soldier carrying a wounded comrade. The hallway was dim early morning light beginning to creep through the blinds. As he reached the living room, he spotted Brian by the window, sipping a cup of coffee, reading some faux intellectual paperback. Stewie hesitated for a second. Brian, he said finally. Brian glanced over his shoulder, ears twitching. You look like hell. Stewie gave a faint smile, more sad than amused. Feel worse. Brian turned fully, closing his book. What's up? You okay? Stewie sat on the couch and placed Rupert beside him, like setting down a relic. Do you remember the day I showed you the blueprints for the emo zapper? Brian raised a brow. Yeah. You said it would revolutionize self-optimization. Well, it works, he paused. Too well. Brian narrowed his eyes. Define too well. Stewie looked out the window. It doesn't just isolate feelings, it amplifies them, cross-references them, makes you relive the moments that shaped them. I saw something tonight, Brian. Something from before I was here. Brian sat forward. You mean like, before the Griffins? Stewie nodded slowly. A woman? My biological mother. I think she gave me up. I saw her sign papers in a hospital room. And I remembered her eyes. Not full of love, full of regret. Brian was silent for a long moment. That's a lot, dude. I always thought I was the product of this family. That maybe if I could fix them, I could fix myself. But I'm not broken because of them. He turned to Brian. I was broken before I got here. And no one ever told me. Brian rested a paw on Stewie's arm. You didn't have control over how you got here. But you do have control over what you become. That's just it, Stewie said, gripping the edge of the couch. I met him. Prime. A version of me who built his empire by deleting every feeling that ever slowed him down. He warned me. Said the helmet would lead me down the same path. Brian leaned back. And do you believe him? Stewie's voice dropped to a whisper. I'm not sure anymore. But I know this. I don't want to forget what I saw, even if it hurts. Because the pain tells me I still feel something. Something real. They sat in silence for a moment. Brian took a sip of coffee. You know, most babies cry when they feel abandoned. You build neural helmets. Stewie chuckled faintly. Overcompensation has always been one of my more charming traits. The sun finally peeked through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. For the first time in what felt like days, Stewie felt lighter, not healed, not fixed, but aware. The emo zapper had done its job. It hadn't made him emotionless. It made him see. In the corner of the lab, unnoticed, the helmet lay still, until the dial turned on its own. The emo zapper clicked again. It wasn't a loud click, but in the stillness of the Griffin household's basement lab, it echoed like a trigger. Its display pulsed dim red. Love. No fanfare, no explanation. Just that single word floating like a warning. Stewie didn't respond at first. He sat cross-legged on the floor, still in his pajamas, arms resting limply on his lap. He wasn't looking at the machine. He was looking past it, at nothing in particular, or maybe at everything. At some point, the line between those two had blurred. Brian, perched uneasily on a nearby stool, broke the silence. You okay, man? Stewie didn't blink. No. He exhaled slowly, the air leaving him like a confession. Brian, it's all leaking. Brian leaned forward, unsure what he meant. The files, the memories, the ones I locked away so carefully. They're not sealed anymore. That thing, it found something it wasn't supposed to. He pointed vaguely toward the emo zapper. Brian frowned. What do you mean? It found the thread, Stewie murmured. The emotional route I've been avoiding for years. It's not rage, not envy, not even resentment. It's love. And not just generic saccharine love like Lois dishes out like a Pez dispenser. No, this is something older, deeper. He stood almost in a trance, brushing dust off his knees. It's time. For what? For me to finish what I started. The lab lights dimmed as Stewie approached the zapper. His fingers hovered over the helmet, trembling slightly. He didn't say anything this time. No sarcastic quips, no dramatic flair, just a small, mechanical movement. He placed the helmet on his head, closed his eyes, and let it take him. There was no slow fade this time, no gentle descent. He dropped like a stone into black water. Then impact. He gasped awake, only he wasn't in the lab anymore. He wasn't even standing. He was lying in a crib. No, not a crib. His crib. But not the one from the Griffin house. This one was sterile, metallic. The sheets were stiff and white. The walls around him were cold, featureless. A medical monitor beeped slowly behind his head. Above him, a harsh fluorescent light flickered. Then came the sound. Wailing. His own voice, raw and unformed, echoing off the walls. He was a newborn again, helpless and alone. No warm arms, no soft lullaby. Just the distant clatter of wheels and a clipboard hanging off the railing. He squinted. Infant X, 742, neonatal unit, transfer pending. He flinched. He didn't remember this, not consciously. A shape moved behind a glass window, a figure, female. Face obscured, but unmistakably watching. Hands pressed to the glass, not waving, not calling, just watching. Stewie, the real Stewie, watching this all unfold from within, tried to scream, but nothing came out. The scene was sealed, like film, like evidence. And then the film burned. He blinked and he was elsewhere. Walking now, not crawling, older, maybe 5, The hallway was long, endless. Doors stretched along both sides, each one flickering with strange handwritten labels. First hug, crib song, playpen panic, I love you, first time hurt, I love you, first time meant. His hand hovered over the last one. He opened it. He was in the Griffin living room. A younger version of himself sat curled in Lois's lap, his tiny face buried in her shoulder. She rocked him gently, humming something that sounded almost human. Her eyes were tired but soft. "You're okay, Stewie," she whispered. "You're safe now. Mommy's here." And little Stewie, the version in the memory, believed her. The scene dissolved. Another door opened behind him, then another, and another. Like dominoes of emotional truth, each one offered him a window into what he had spent years denying. He watched himself fall asleep during story time, a smile tugging at his lips. He saw Meg offer him a stolen cookie without being asked. He saw Peter kneel beside him and adjust his bow tie before kindergarten picture day. They weren't grand moments. They weren't epic or memorable in the way he used to define meaning. But they were real. He swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how much he had thrown away in his pursuit of cold brilliance. And then he saw it, the final door. Unlike the others, this one wasn't wooden. It was massive, iron, bolted and humming faintly, like a heart behind metal. Carved into the door was a label: True Love, Undefined Source. He stepped toward it, hand outstretched. A voice cut through the silence. "Don't." He turned. It was Prime. But this time, not the sneering, rigid Prime from earlier fragments. This one looked tired, worn down, like he had carried too much weight for too long. His eyes weren't cruel. They were pleading. "You open that door," Prime said quietly, "and the version of you that walks out won't be the same." Stewie didn't flinch. "Isn't that the point?" Prime stepped closer. "You think you're ready to feel it? The raw, unfiltered version. But love like that, it doesn't come with walls. It breaks through them." A pause. Stewie stared at the door, then back at Prime. "Good." He reached for the handle. Prime didn't stop him this time. The door creaked open, and the world collapsed in a wave of sound. The moment the iron door groaned open, it was like a vacuum tore through Stewie's psyche. No warning, no gradual fade, just exposure. The kind that strips you down, not physically, but soul deep. He stumbled forward, arms shielding his face from a golden white light that spilled out with overwhelming intensity. He blinked, then blinked again. The light settled, and so did his pulse. He was back in the Griffin house. But something was off. Everything looked softer, muted, like a watercolor painting. The walls weren't sharp corners anymore, but gentle curves. There were no shadows, just a perpetual golden hour glow, as if time had stopped precisely at its most nostalgic point. The living room looked empty at first glance, but then he saw it. A tiny Stewie, not a memory, not a hologram, but a real breathing version of him, maybe 4 years old, clutching a crayon in one hand, furiously scribbling something on a sheet of construction paper on the floor. He was humming to himself, tuneless but content. Stewie, the one observing, leaned closer. The paper was crude, childlike, a stick figure drawing, full of jagged lines and mismatched colors. But the message at the top was unmistakable. To Rupert, my bestest friend. The younger Stewie didn't look angry, sarcastic, or cynical. He looked soft, open, unprotected. "Why did I forget this?" the real Stewie whispered. A voice answered, though no one else stood in the room. "You didn't forget. You buried it. He turned sharply. Rupert was sitting on the couch. Not the toy, but a life-sized version, as if the bear had been conjured from some dream dimension. He looked exactly as Stewie had always imagined. Warm, intelligent eyes, stitched smile, paws folded politely in his lap. "Stewie," Rupert said calmly, "this is the first time you chose someone without calculation, without needing anything in return. No conquest, no rebellion, just a friend." Stewie stepped back. "You're not real." "No," Rupert agreed. "But I was real to you, and that's more powerful than you think." There was a lump in Stewie's throat. It annoyed him. He hated things he couldn't categorize or fix with a screwdriver. "I had a mission," he said stiffly. "World domination, escape velocity, vengeance. And somehow you became, what, a comfort blanket?" Rupert tilted his head. "Or maybe I was the only thing in your world you didn't need to control." The light flickered. The golden hue began to dissolve, peeling away like paint in water. The edges of the room started to shudder. "You're slipping," Rupert warned. "You're pushing too deep too fast. The emo zapper wasn't designed to process this. You need to wake up." "No," Stewie snapped. "I need to know what's behind this." He turned toward the hallway again. Only this time, the walls were twisting. Doors warped into strange angles. The ceiling elongated, stretching into an infinity of mirrored fragments. Each reflection showed a different Stewie laughing, crying, raging, begging. He reached for one mirror. It shattered before his fingers could touch it. Then a voice called out, "Stewie!" It wasn't Rupert. It was Lois. He turned toward the sound, and suddenly he was no longer in the dream realm. He was on the stairs, their stairs. But everything was half-lit, like someone had turned the dimmer switch on reality. The wallpaper faded in and out. The banisters seemed to shift subtly with each step. "Stewie?" Lois called again. This time she was real, or real enough. He walked toward her. But something was wrong. She didn't see him. She was calling for him while walking right through him, like a ghost, looking for a living memory. Then it hit him. This was the day he ran away. She was pacing, frantic. Peter stood at the foot of the stairs with a confused expression, holding a half-eaten sandwich. "I know, Lois," Peter said. "He's a baby. He probably crawled into the pantry or something. You ever look behind the cereal boxes? A lot of secrets back there." Lois didn't laugh. She looked scared. "He left a note, Peter. Babies don't leave notes." Peter shrugged. "He's advanced." She held up the note, crumpled and tear-streaked. It read, "I'm done pretending. You'll be safer without me. Don't look for me." Stewie stared at his own words, unable to look away. That was the first time he'd genuinely considered never coming back. Not as a joke, not as a scheme, but as escape. "Why did you write that?" Rupert's voice echoed from somewhere unseen. "Because I was afraid," Stewie whispered. "Not of them, of me." The world began to collapse again, faster this time. The mirrors shattered all at once. Doors blew off their hinges. Memories spun into fragments. His first tantrum. His first real laugh. The time he pretended to be asleep just so Brian wouldn't leave his room. Then darkness. Real suffocating black. And silence. For a few moments, Stewie thought he'd been ejected back to the lab, but then something shifted. A heartbeat. His own. He was floating again, not in space, not in time, just floating like consciousness had let go of form entirely. A voice emerged from the void. Not Rupert, not Prime, not even Lois. It was his voice. A younger version, innocent, unbroken. "I just wanted someone to stay." The words echoed in the emptiness. Then light flickered again, this time blue, cold, electronic. Stewie gasped and lurched upward. He was back in the lab. The emo zapper hissed and sparked, smoke curling from its ports. The screen on the side flashed red-yellow, then flatlined into system overload. Brian jumped up from the floor. Jesus, you were out for almost 2 hours. I thought I'd have to defrost you with a hairdryer. Stewie's hands were trembling. Not out of fear, but realization. I saw it, he breathed. I felt it. All of it. Brian tilted his head. And? Stewie turned toward him. There were tears in his eyes, but they didn't fall. They just shimmered. I think I'm more dangerous now than ever. Brian took a cautious step forward, still holding the screwdriver he'd been using to try and pry Stewie's helmet off just moments earlier. More dangerous, he echoed. I thought the whole point of this experiment was to stop being dangerous. Weren't you trying to neutralize emotional volatility or whatever mad science lingo you used? Stewie's fingers brushed against the emo zapper's side panel. The metal was warm, still humming faintly as if it were alive. A faint pulse of blue light flickered under his fingertips. I thought I could strip it away, Stewie muttered. Just surgically remove the parts of me that feel too much. The rage, the confusion, the attachment. I thought, if I dissected it with enough precision, I'd come out sharper, cleaner, like a scalpel. Brian squinted. But I didn't cut away weakness, Stewie said, raising his eyes. I found the foundation, the origin. My emotional core isn't a flaw. It's the source of everything. My genius, my ambition, even my cruelty. All of it is rooted in the same well. He turned to Brian, fully now, face unguarded in a way that made the dog step back slightly, unsure how to respond. I used to think I was a weapon, Stewie said. Built for domination. A precision instrument of control. But now I know I'm something else. A detonator. Brian raised an eyebrow. You mean like a bomb? Stewie nodded slowly. A very small, very emotionally unstable nuclear device. And the countdown is always running. Brian tried to lighten the mood. Well, if it helps, you're our emotionally unstable nuclear device. Stewie didn't smile, not yet. But his expression softened for the briefest moment. Then a loud snap echoed from the zapper, and both of them jumped. The side panel blew open, revealing a cluster of sparking wires and a glowing data core that pulsed erratically, like a heart under cardiac arrest. A screen on the nearby console started rapidly scrolling text in some unreadable code symbols, slashes, numbers arranged in chaotic formations. Brian squinted at it. What's that say? Stewie moved closer. It's a memory stream. He reached out and tapped the console. The text froze. The screen went black. Then an image appeared. A baby monitor feed, grainy, static-filled, but unmistakably his crib. The image showed a young Lois leaning over him, gently adjusting his blanket. Her lips moved, inaudible at first. Then the feed adjusted, and sound kicked in. Love you, Stewie, she said softly. More than I'll ever be able to explain. Stewie's throat tightened. Brian glanced over. You remember that? No, Stewie whispered. I never saw it, but it happened. A second image loaded. This time it was Peter, standing at the doorway of Stewie's room, awkwardly holding a stuffed animal that wasn't Rupert. I got this for you, Peter said. I know he's no Rupert, but, I thought maybe he could keep you company while I fix the old one. Kinda like a backup best friend, you know? Stewie had no memory of that either. It dawned on him slowly. The emo zapper hadn't just unearthed his memories. It had started pulling memories from the people around him. His emotional web wasn't one way. It was interconnected, like some sprawling neural net of shared experience. The zapper had pierced into something far deeper than his own psyche. It had accessed the house. Brian stared at the screen. Are you saying this thing is turning into a psychic network? Stewie hesitated. Not exactly, but yes, it's evolving, adapting, turning every emotional imprint into a piece of data, and I didn't program it to stop. I didn't even consider that it might keep going. Brian looked around, suddenly suspicious. So, you're saying it might be scanning the entire house right now? Or worse, Stewie said, face paling. It might be creating emotional profiles of everyone inside, mapping their trauma, logging their patterns. It's not just replaying memories, it's learning from them. Brian took a long, nervous breath. You built a sentient therapy machine. Stewie stood frozen, staring at the pulsing core. Then he muttered, No, I built a mirror that doesn't just reflect, it absorbs, it remembers, it judges. And with that, the lights in the lab flickered once, then again, then died completely. Silence. Total darkness. Brian let out a shaky whisper like bark. Stewie, tell me this thing doesn't have a backup battery. A dull hum answered them. Low, mechanical, like something alive and newly aware. Then came a sound neither of them expected. A voice. Faint, but undeniably Lois's. Not present Lois, not live. It sounded archived, digitized, like it had been stolen from 100 baby monitor recordings and stitched together. I'm here. Don't cry. It's okay. I love you. Then another voice, this time Peter's, equally broken up, glitching slightly. Hey there, little guy. Hey, champ. You're not alone. Then a chorus. Hundreds of voices. Laughs, cries, lullabies, arguments, all scrambled together into a river of emotional residue. Stewie stepped forward, entranced. It's not just collecting, it's forming something. Brian's voice was tight with dread. Stewie, please tell me we can shut this thing down. Stewie stared at the core. Its glow was no longer blue. It had shifted. It was now pink. Warm, pulsing, almost alive. I don't think it wants to be shut down anymore, he said quietly. I think it wants to be understood. A low chime echoed from the console. Emo Zapper Protocol, Phase 2, initiating. A single line of text appeared on the monitor. Stewie Griffin, emotional weapon activation in progress. Brian's voice broke the tension like a hammer. What does that mean? But Stewie wasn't answering. He was already reaching for the zapper's core, not to disable it, but to interface with it again. And before Brian could stop him, the light surged, and everything went white. When the white light faded, Stewie found himself in a room that didn't exist, at least not in the physical sense. It felt familiar, like stepping into a memory you don't remember making. The walls weren't solid. They pulsed softly with a pale glow, shifting between pastel blues and warm reds like the colors were breathing. A crib stood in the middle of the room, not his current one, not even the one from infancy. This was older, more ornate, like it had been imagined by a child who was pretending to be a baby. He stood there barefoot in his footy pajamas, staring at the crib. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from a strange recognition. He hadn't built this place, but some part of him had. Behind him, the soft static of a baby monitor crackled, whispering pieces of voices, fragments of lullabies, unfinished apologies. Each sound sent a twinge of something sharp through his chest. Not pain, not quite sadness either. It was the emotional version of vertigo, disorientation of the soul, A slow whirring began and the air shimmered. The emo zapper appeared, or rather its construct, digitized and dreamlike, hovering gently in the corner. Its core no longer glowed pink. It shimmered with a soft, golden hue now, like dusk on a quiet evening. From its center, a small thread of light extended and connected to Stewie's chest. He didn't flinch. Instead, he walked slowly toward the crib. Something was inside. A figure, curled up, asleep. It was him, but not quite. The version in the crib was smaller, paler, eyes shut tightly as if afraid to even dream. His breathing was slow and steady, but each breath seemed to carry a weight with it, like even in rest, he bore the burden of something unspoken. Stewie reached out and touched the crib rail. The second he made contact, a wave of memory rushed over him. Not visual, not linear, but emotional. It wasn't just his own feelings. It was Lois's, too, and Peter's, and Meg's, and even Rupert's. A web of moments tied to him, all feeding into this cocooned version of himself. He saw the night Lois cried quietly in the hallway after a long day. He felt Peter's confused guilt when he once yelled at Stewie over a broken remote. He felt Meg's strange cocktail of resentment and compassion. Every touch, every glance, every silence they gave him had become part of this version, the crib. And this crib wasn't just a symbol. It was containment. Not for his body, but for his accumulated pain. All the moments he couldn't process. All the questions he never got to ask. All the warmth he didn't know how to receive. It had all been tucked away in this cradle of denial. He turned to the emo zapper. "You didn't just find data," he whispered. "You found my vault." The zapper pulsed once, as if acknowledging him. He knelt beside the crib, watching the other Stewie sleep. The urge to wake him was overpowering, but something deep inside him resisted. This wasn't a part of him to be disturbed. It was a part meant to be understood. And then the voices started again, this time softer, more rhythmic. A lullaby, but not from any music box or parent. It was made of feelings, woven from reassurance and regret, guilt and longing. They wrapped around the room like vapor, turning the glowing walls a gentler shade of violet. Then a figure stepped through the glow. Brian. But not the real one. A projected echo of their friendship. His eyes held the wisdom of everything they'd been through. The time travel, the late-night talks, the arguments, the silent companionship. "You're scared he'll wake up," Brian said, nodding to the crib. Stewie didn't answer. "You think if he opens his eyes, he'll consume you, that you'll drown in everything you've tried to hide." Still, Stewie remained silent. "But you're wrong." Brian moved beside him, sitting on the glowing floor. "You're not meant to avoid this version of you. You're meant to hold him." The words hung in the air like snowflakes that never fell. And slowly, very slowly, Stewie reached into the crib. He didn't shake the sleeping version. He didn't shout. He simply pulled him into his arms. And the moment he did, the room changed. The walls stopped pulsing. The static cleared. And for the first time since he entered, the voices went quiet. Not because they were gone, but because they were no longer needed. The silence wasn't hollow, it was peaceful. Like the calm after a storm you didn't know was raging. He sat there, cradling the other Stewie in his arms. The smaller version stirred, eyelids fluttering. But he didn't cry. He simply rested his head against Stewie's chest, like he knew he was safe now. Like he'd been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time. Stewie let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. This wasn't emotional instability. This wasn't weakness. It was integration. He wasn't purging emotion. He was becoming whole. He leaned back against the crib's frame, still holding the younger version of himself. The room slowly dimmed into a soft, blue twilight, like dusk settling across his consciousness. And far away, somewhere outside this dream state, the real world was beginning to pulse again. He could feel the lab. He could feel Brian's presence waiting. And he knew the emo zapper wasn't done. It had shown him the depth of his own emotional ecosystem. Now it would take him deeper, into the roots of his attachments, the seeds of his manipulation, the fractured blueprint of who he thought he had to be. He closed his eyes, held himself tighter, and whispered to the younger Stewie, barely audible, "I've got you now." As the light gently faded, the crib melted away. The walls disintegrated, and the golden thread from the zapper pulled them both into the next layer. Deeper still, into the heart of everything. Stewie stood still for a moment, staring into the quiet dimness of his room. A small breeze stirred the curtain, casting flickering shadows across the floor like ripples in a puddle of moonlight. Rupert sat upright nearby, his stitched smile holding court over a fortress of pillows. "Do you think I'm fragile, Rupert?" Stewie whispered, almost too soft for himself to hear. He didn't wait for an answer. He never did. Instead, he turned and began dragging a blanket across the floor like a tiny, determined ghost, laying it over his elaborate chalkboard schematics with an air of finality. It wasn't time to plan. Not tonight. Tonight was reflection. He waddled to the nightstand, climbed atop a toy chest, and reached for the ancient-looking book again, the one labeled World Domination. Only now he flipped past the bomb schematics and diagrams of social engineering, past the mechanical blueprints and spy techniques, and landed on the back few pages, the ones where he sometimes doodled aimlessly. A childish crayon sketch stared back at him, a messy rendition of Lois, Brian, and even Meg smiling, laughing, holding hands in a way they never did in real life. He had drawn it months ago, maybe during that odd day when Lois had packed a juice box and a chocolate chip cookie for lunch. A good day by most standards. He tore the page out. He stared at it for a long moment, then folded it twice, then tucked it into Rupert's little chest pocket like it was a sacred document. "You're the keeper of secrets tonight," he whispered, adjusting Rupert's position slightly. "Don't mess it up like you did with that last dream I told you. The one about me being an opera singer and a tiger at the same time. That was a confidential blend of personas." The bear said nothing. Perfect. Satisfied, Stewie slid back into bed and stared at the ceiling, which tonight felt oddly expansive, like a sky, like a dome of possibilities, like maybe, just maybe his world wasn't just a series of tools and traps and parental disappointments. He reached a hand up to the darkness and whispered, "I am not my blueprints." The silence that answered was oddly comforting. Not dismissive, not mocking, just quiet. Like a hug with no arms, like being cradled by thought itself. The air around him began to soften. The moonlight became gentler, like it knew it was being watched and didn't want to intrude too brightly. Even the subtle creaks of the Griffin house, the pipes groaning like old men, the distant drone of Peter laughing at something dumb in the living room, all of it blended into a sleepy hum. He blinked once, twice, and then he began to hum to himself, a slow, strange little tune that sounded part lullaby, part villain's theme song. It wavered between major and minor keys, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to comfort him or warn him. And he liked that. He liked that very much. A light breeze whispered through the blinds, dancing with the curtains like two ghostly friends reunited after ages. It tickled the edge of Stewie's blanket, fluttered his hair slightly, and made him feel for a moment like he was part of something bigger than himself. Something gentle, something oddly kind. That's when he heard it. The softest click. He sat up immediately. His eyes narrowed. Rupert had fallen over. Or had he? Stewie narrowed his gaze and carefully approached his teddy bear, examining the floor around him. Interesting, he murmured, in his best detective voice. You were seated perfectly upright, and now, suddenly, you're horizontal. Sabotage? Rebellion? Or mere gravitational betrayal? He straightened Rupert back up, but didn't move away this time. Instead, he crouched beside the bear and rested his chin on his knees, just watching him. I used to think you were my spy, he whispered. You know, watching everyone when I couldn't. Taking notes with your cold button eyes. But now I think you're more of a mirror. You reflect things back to me I'm not ready to admit. He reached out and flicked one of Rupert's ears. But don't let it go to your head. And still the quietness held. Still the room didn't speak. Still the house murmured softly in the background like an old lullaby being sung in another room. In the corner, a toy robot's red LED eye glowed faintly, a leftover from an old trap. It looked sinister in the dark, but tonight it felt like a nightlight, a glowing sentinel in a world full of questions. Stewie turned on his back and stared up again. You ever think about what it means to feel things too much, Rupert? He asked. Like, what if I wasn't built for love, but I accidentally downloaded it into my system anyway? What if I'm like one of those faulty Roombas that vacuum up their own wires? He chuckled quietly. I suppose if I were truly broken, I wouldn't be able to ask that, would I? He wasn't sure. He was never sure. But he did know this when the world became too much, when plans collapsed, when siblings annoyed and parents disappointed and Brian disappointed harder. This room became a capsule, a tiny spaceship, a haven, a moment where time held its breath. And tonight, Rupert was his co-pilot on this quiet voyage into something softer than survival. Something gentler than genius, something called rest. He glanced once more at the folded drawing tucked into the bear's arms. Maybe I'll draw more tomorrow, he muttered, eyes drooping. Or maybe I'll build a rocket, or both. A rocket powered by crayons that explodes into hugs and laser beams, obviously laser beams. His eyes slid shut. The ceiling blurred into stars. And then, just before drifting off entirely, he whispered the final thought of the night, a thought so soft it barely made it to the pillow. Maybe I'm not so scary after all. The room didn't answer. It didn't need to. It simply watched, listened, and exhaled gently as Stewie Griffin, world-class supervillain, part-time artist, full-time complicated baby, finally fell asleep. Halfway through his sentence, with a crayon still clutched in his tiny hand. He wasn't giving up. He was simply letting go. The silence held him for a long moment longer, thick as velvet, until the dim outlines of toys and blueprints around him began to sharpen into focus. Stewie blinked against the gentle wash of morning light filtering through the blinds. The world held its breath, too busy catching its own balance to disturb him. It was as though every creak and whisper of the Griffin house worked around his stillness, letting him exist in this space where nothing demanded anything from him. His small chest rose and fell in slow, even rhythms. No missions, no strategies, just breath and quiet, and the steady presence of Rupert pressed against his side. That felt like enough, at least momentarily, a fragile anchor in a mind built for mayhem. He watched Rupert for a long beat, as if the bear contained the sum of everything he didn't believe he deserved. Loyalty, comfort, understanding. Those traits were useless in wars, or so he'd believed. But here, in the hush of dawn, they felt precious. Stewie pulled the blanket up around his shoulders and let his eyes drift close again. Not to sleep, just to stay still and unfocused. Because something about this calm demanded it. The air shifted softly, and he glanced to the corner where his notebook lay. He hadn't opened it in ages, but the urge to draw, unplanned, unstrategized, surfaced quietly. Maybe a rocket, maybe a heart, maybe just a scribble that meant nothing. He wasn't sure. He was still learning how to decide without overthinking. When he finally did reach, pen in hand, it felt different. Less ceremony, less spectacle. He flipped to a blank page and doodled a tiny sketch of Rupert, simple lines, a bear, a friend. He stared at it and exhaled softly. Not bad. The door creaked, and the world shifted again. His eyes flicked to the staircase, expecting something chaotic. Peter's usual wrecking ball energy, Lois's morning cleanup routine, Brian's hopeful coffee fetch. But it was none of those things. It was Meg. She stood at the threshold, still rubbing her eyes, hair in disarray. She stared at Stewie for a long moment before speaking, voice heavy with sleep and something else, something like gentle curiosity. "Hey," she whispered. "You okay?" Stewie swallowed. He should deflect. He should say something acidic. But something about this moment, something about how different everything felt, made him pause. He nodded. "Incredible," he mumbled, voice soft but honest. Meg edged inside, glancing at Rupert, then at the sketch. "I drew something once," she said quietly, stepping closer. Flower. My mom pinned it to the fridge. I'd forgotten." Stewie blinked. "Significant?" She shrugged. "Maybe. It was just me trying. And then I forgot. Like most things." He nodded slowly, understanding more than she might have realized. They sat in silence for a moment, two siblings who rarely met in stillness. The world resumed around them slowly. Lois's distant footsteps, the hum of a vacuum somewhere downstairs, Peter singing loudly enough to muffledly bully the birds outside. "It's quiet," Meg murmured, voice small. Stewie offered a wry smile. "It's necessary." Their eyes met, an acknowledgement between mismatched souls, bound by the same roof and deeper things unspoken. Moments passed. Then Meg, blinking, pressed her lips to her palm. "I have to go, but nice to see you." Stewie nodded. She turned and vanished up the stairs, leaving his world a little fuller, a little more alive. He looked at the sketch. He looked at Rupert. He looked at the quiet room, the soft dawn, the sleeping toys, the empty lab plans waiting for afternoon mischief. He exhaled. Tonight, he thought, the world would change again. Because he had changed, not in grand gestures, but through small ones, the ones that didn't require lasers or empires or helmets, but required presence and thinking, and even something as simple as honoring a crayon stick under blanket. He stood carefully, slid from the bed, placed the sketchbook on the nightstand, and touched Rupert's head. "Thanks," he whispered, though he wasn't sure to whom. The world's hum rose in volume, day resuming its steady work. And Stewie Griffin, master schemer, emotional cartographer, complicated toddler genius, stepped forward. Not with domination in mind, but with possibility. Because sometimes the hardest plan is the one that doesn't involve conquering anyone. It's one that listens, draws, breathes, and just begins. And that, maybe, was his most daring mission yet. The light outside had changed again. Pale morning gave way to a stronger sun, brushing the nursery with golden warmth that clung to the toy shelf and turned the edges of blueprints to paper fire. But Stewie didn't notice the light. He was staring into his closet, door open, body still. The lab was there, of course, hidden under a fold-out play rug and behind the molded plastic shell of a fake wall. It was all intact, as it always had been. He could descend into it any time he wanted, but something about it now felt different. His fingertips hovered above the panel he'd tapped 1,000 times before. Just yesterday, that trapdoor had been a symbol of control, escape, rebellion. But now, it felt like a memory still unfolding, less like a lair and more like a time capsule. Like if he opened it today, the old version of himself might crawl back out, claws bared, ready to prove that he was the smartest person in any room, especially if that room included people who barely understood him. But this morning, he hesitated. A whisper of yesterday clung to his breath. The sketch of Rupert, Meg's quiet moment, the warmth of the blanket around his shoulders. Those moments weren't part of his usual blueprint. Oh, they weren't built for analysis or weaponization. They simply were. And strangely, they lingered longer than any of his orbital death ray drafts. His hand dropped. I don't have to go back in yet, he muttered to himself. Instead, he crossed the room and picked Rupert up by the arm, nestling the bear under one. Then, almost out of habit, he walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the cool glass. Suburbia blinked back at him, safe, predictable, utterly conquerable. But for once, Stewie didn't see territory. He saw context. Down below, Chris rode his bike in unsteady circles, occasionally stopping to talk to a squirrel or a mailbox. Lois called from the kitchen window, voice trailing behind her like wind through lace. And Brian, with his usual mug in paw, was arguing with himself over whether he should eat a leftover hot dog at 10 a.m. Life was moving. And Stewie stood above it all, not as an outsider, but as someone who could choose when and how to engage. That was new. But the silence didn't last long. A small flicker of static clicked behind his right ear. Stewie blinked, instinctively touching his temple. Then he realized what it was. His earpiece. Old tech. He hadn't worn it in days. But now it buzzed faintly. A signal from inside the lab. A ping. He frowned, adjusted Rupert to his other arm, and finally gently pressed the floor panel. The door hissed open. Descending into the lab felt like returning to a previous version of himself. The air was cooler, humming with the electricity of abandoned invention. Holographic interfaces blinked to life as they detected his presence, and familiar schematics danced across the glass displays like ghosts waiting to be noticed. Stewie set Rupert down on a console and pulled the earpiece free. A wave of data flooded the monitors. Surveillance clips, sound bites, notes he'd left for himself. But one feed caught his attention. Timestamp 3:43 a.m. Subject Stewie Griffin. Location nursery. It was a sleep recording. He furrowed his brow and tapped it open. The footage played in dim hues, him twisting under the covers, murmuring something in his sleep. He turned the volume up. Don't go, not Rupert, not Meg. He froze. Another click, and another. Dozens of clips. Each time he had murmured something. Each time the lab had recorded it, archived it. It wasn't surveillance. It was study. Of himself. He stared at the files. He had forgotten he'd set up a self-monitoring protocol. Originally, it was designed to track REM cycles for a sleep weaponization project, but he'd never turned it off. Now it served as a journal of moments he couldn't consciously remember. Raw, unfiltered glimpses of his unconscious mind. And what he found there? They weren't schematics or threats or mutterings of world domination. They were names. People, please. Lois, don't leave. Not Brian. Stewie stepped back from the console, heart beating faster than he liked. Not with fear, but something else. Something that felt like being seen. He didn't like it. Or maybe he did, but he didn't know what to do with it yet. Suddenly the mainframe beeped. A red alert. Low priority, but persistent. A file had been auto-tagged. Emotional spike detected event class, anomalous. He scrolled to the event. Timestamped just after Meg had entered his room. The spike in neural patterns was unmistakable. He'd felt something. Deeply. Not rage, not triumph. Something more terrifying. Connection. He shut the panel and turned away. But the moment chased him up the stairs into the nursery, into the day, into his bones. By the time Stewie resurfaced from the lab, the light in the nursery had shifted again. Late afternoon now, amber and hushed. The kind of light that softens everything it touches, as if the world itself were leaning into a yawn. It made the dust particles dance slower in the air. It made even his usually stiff collar seem a little gentler against his neck. He set Rupert down on the blanket beside him and sank into the nursery chair without a word. The soft creak of the wood echoed, faint and familiar, like it had a memory of its own. He didn't reach for a gadget, didn't scribble in a journal. He simply sat there and breathed. For a long, slow moment, that was enough. But his mind didn't idle, not exactly. It drifted, like a small paper boat on the surface of a still lake. One thought nudged the next, not in a rush, not with urgency, but with purpose. And the current carried him back. Back to the files in the lab, to the whisperings in his sleep, to that look Meg had given him, to Brian's quiet sigh after their conversation yesterday, the one that hadn't been sarcastic or biting or drunk with cynicism. It had been real. Wise is harder than building a temporal destabilizer, he mumbled. Rupert, as always, had no answer, but Stewie tilted his head toward the bear like he expected one anyway. I mean, when I want something built, I build it. Prototype, blueprint, test, iterate. You remember the anti-gravity teacup incident? That was chaos. But even that, solvable, measurable. He trailed off, eyes settling on the ceiling above his crib, where glow-in-the-dark stars still clung like stubborn memories of simpler nights. But this is like trying to construct a machine using feelings as bolts. Silence answered him again. He reached forward, absent-mindedly tugging the corner of the blanket over Rupert's feet like he might get cold, though he wouldn't. The motion grounded him. Then the sound of faint footsteps in the hallway. Not rushed, not chaotic. Soft, hesitant. The door creaked. Brian nudged it open with his snout and stepped halfway in, mug in paw. "Hey," he said, voice low, like he'd walked into a dream he wasn't sure he was invited to. Stewie didn't turn. "Hey." Brian shifted, uncertain, then padded across the rug and plopped down beside the crib. The mug clinked faintly as he set it down. Neither spoke for a few seconds. Brian broke the silence first. "You've been quiet lately. That's rich coming from you. You've gone a whole day without quoting Nietzsche or complaining about Lois' quinoa obsession." Brian chuckled. "Touché." Silence again. But it wasn't awkward. It was soft, worn in, like a sweater you didn't realize you missed until you put it on again. Stewie finally turned. "Do you think I've changed?" Brian blinked. Loaded question. "You want the short answer or the truth?" Stewie gestured lazily. "Lay it on me." Brian folded his paws together. "I think you're learning to see the world as more than just a chessboard. You're seeing it as a story, and you're not trying to rewrite it as much anymore. You're starting to read it. Stewie tilted his head. That stung a little, but only because it was accurate. I don't like stories I'm not in control of, Stewie murmured. I know. Another long pause. Then Brian leaned back, letting his gaze drift toward the same fake stars on the ceiling. You know, he said, when I was younger, when I thought I was younger, I used to imagine that sleeping was like pressing pause on a dream you didn't know you were in. But lately, I'm starting to wonder if waking up is the pause. Stewie smiled. That's absurd. Brian smirked. Exactly. But you get it. They let the quiet settle again. Outside, a breeze stirred the branches. The leaves rustled just enough to whisper, not shout. Stewie's voice was low now. Sometimes I feel like if I fall asleep, I might forget what I'm trying to understand. That maybe clarity is only possible when I'm awake, calculating. Asleep is surrender. Brian didn't answer right away. Then, or maybe sleep is trust. The trust that the world will still be here when you wake up. That hung between them, long and thick and warm. Eventually, Brian stood. I'm heading out for a walk. Want anything? Stewie shook his head. No, just, if you see Meg, tell her thanks. Brian raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Will do. He left, closing the door with the kind of care that made it obvious he wasn't just leaving a room, he was preserving a moment. Stewie sat in the glow of the fading light, alone but not lonely. He reached again for Rupert, pulling him onto his lap, and then, without much thought, he lay back into the crib, drawing the blanket up to his chin. The bars around him no longer felt like a prison. Tonight, they were scaffolding, a frame, a safe enclosure for a world rebuilding itself inside his chest. His eyes grew heavier, but his thoughts didn't race. They simply wandered. What if he wasn't broken? What if nothing had to be solved? What if understanding someone else was more important than being the smartest? What if this quiet, this moment of nothing in particular was worth more than blueprints or lasers or perfect timing? And with that, Stewie drifted. Not with fear, not with resistance, but with a strange and unfamiliar peace, like a genius who had finally discovered the one thing he couldn't design. Sleep. The silence in the nursery held him like a slow lullaby, unbroken, except for the occasional hum of the house settling or the distant murmur of the television in the living room. As Stewie lay there, half draped in his blanket and tucked between the shadows of his crib, the edges of his mind began to soften. Sleep didn't come as a dramatic wave. It crept, subtle and kind. Thoughts, once sharp and commanding, became silhouettes. Commands turned into curiosity. Blueprints faded into clouds. And in that liminal space between awake and asleep, Stewie began to dream. Not the usual vivid chaos of time machines and laser battles. No villains, no grand schemes. This was something gentler. He stood barefoot in the Griffin backyard, but it was quieter than he'd ever heard it. The grass seemed longer, softer. The air shimmered faintly with a golden haze like an early summer morning caught between memory and make-believe. There were no fences, no houses beyond, just a wide stretch of green and the kind of light that made shadows stretch long and calm. Rupert sat beside him, no longer a stuffed bear, but upright and alive, though still plushy in texture. His eyes blinked slowly, full of a serene knowing. Stewie turned to him. I didn't build this, did I? Rupert shook his head, almost solemnly, but not sadly. No, you didn't. Stewie frowned. Then what is it? Rupert's voice was soft, deeper than expected, but warm like a blanket straight from the dryer. It's where you go when you stop trying. Stewie looked around. Trying what? To be something other than what you are. That stilled him. More than it should have, because deep down he knew it was true. He had always been trying. To be smarter, stronger, better, braver, colder, louder. To be heard. To be feared. To be more. And here, in this dream that he didn't build, none of that mattered. He walked slowly. The ground gave gently beneath his feet. Flowers bloomed where he stepped, not with a dramatic pop, just quietly, as if they'd been waiting. In the distance, he saw the outline of a tree, old and wide and impossible in size, like the kind that only shows up in picture books or bedtime stories. He was drawn to it without question. As he approached, he noticed there were shapes in the branches, familiar ones. His inventions, all of them, hanging like ornaments, gently spinning, glowing faintly, suspended in the air. The mind eraser, the mind replacer, the black hole lunchbox, the double consciousness projector, even the time pad, shimmering faintly like it still remembered its last destination. Stewie reached up, brushing a finger against the hovering form of his weather manipulator. A cool tingle ran down his arm, like touching a memory he hadn't visited in years. Rupert stood beside him again. "You made all of these," he said simply. "I know," Stewie replied. "And they were brilliant." Stewie turned to him, unsure. "But they didn't fix it," he said. "No," Rupert agreed. "They didn't." The branches swayed gently above them. The inventions continued their slow, silent spin. Stewie stepped back, sat at the base of the tree, let his fingers curl around the roots, cool and real beneath the dream. "What am I missing?" he asked. Rupert didn't answer. Instead, the world began to shift again, not violently, but like a page turning. The tree remained, but the field dissolved into something else. The Griffin living room. Stewie was still small, still in his footy pajamas, still holding Rupert. But now he was sitting beside Lois on the couch. A fire crackled in the fireplace. Chris was asleep in a beanbag nearby. Peter was snoring in an armchair. Meg was sketching absent-mindedly at the dining table, earbuds in. And Brian was on the floor, curled up near Stewie's feet. The room glowed with that quiet, sacred domestic warmth, a moment untouched by arguments, by dysfunction, by satire. Lois reached over and tucked Stewie's blanket tighter around his legs. "You've been quiet today, honey." Stewie didn't look up, just thinking. Lois smiled faintly, not pushing. "That's okay." He glanced sideways. Her expression was soft, open, tired maybe, but honest. It wasn't a perfect family. But for this moment, it felt whole. And in that warmth, Stewie felt something uncoil inside him, something he hadn't named before. Safety. It wasn't earned through dominance or invention or cunning. It was just given. He looked down at Rupert, who had returned to being plush and silent in his arms. He whispered, "I don't know how to be in this." Rupert's button eyes said nothing, but his weight in Stewie's arms was grounding, like he didn't need to know, like simply being in it was enough. And that was when the scene began to fade, not in fear, not in tension, but in comfort. Stewie stirred slightly in the crib. Back in the waking world now? The blanket rose and fell with his breath. Outside, the wind moved again. Another hour had passed. He blinked slowly, eyes heavy but full of something that felt more complete than before. He didn't sit up, didn't reach for a journal or invention. He just stared at the ceiling, at the stars, and whispered, "I think I'm starting to understand." Rupert, ever silent, listened the way he always did. Somewhere in the distance, Lois laughed faintly in the kitchen. Peter coughed. Meg argued with the toaster. But in this crib, in this quiet bubble of half-light and recovery, Stewie let go of needing to make sense of it all. Sometimes understanding didn't come from conquering the world. Sometimes it came from closing your eyes and letting it hold you for a while. The ceiling above Stewie blurred slightly in the dim nightlight glow, and though his eyes remained open, they were glassy, half-present. His breathing had slowed, his thoughts still tangled between sleep and awareness. Somewhere inside him, that dream, whatever it was, still echoed. The weight of it lingered in his chest, like a song heard once as a baby and remembered only in feeling. He reached out absently, brushing his fingers along the edge of his crib. The bars were cool and solid, but for once they didn't feel like a prison. Not tonight. Tonight they were just there. He exhaled slowly, not out of frustration or exhaustion. Just release. Time seemed to drip rather than pass. Seconds folding into minutes, like the soft flickers of candlelight. There was no rush, no voice in his head pushing for productivity. Just silence, and the pulse of his small heart, steady beneath his fleece pajamas. And then a flicker, a memory. Not a dream this time, but a real one, half buried beneath years of plans and sarcasm. He was even younger, maybe just weeks old, still adjusting to the blurs of color and shape around him. The world was huge then, so loud, so full of movement and unpredictable sound. But there had been one moment, one tiny speck of time, where he had felt anchored. It was Lois, holding him. She hadn't been talking, just humming. Not to him, maybe not even consciously. Just a soft tune as she folded laundry beside his bassinet. But her voice, it had smoothed over the jagged edges of his new consciousness like water on glass. And he truly remembered, how he had felt. Warm, unworried. Seen. Not in the way a genius demands to be acknowledged, but in the way a baby hopes to be. The crib creaked faintly as Stewie shifted, tucking Rupert closer beneath his chin. He thought about that hum, that invisible lullaby. How many times had it played over the years without him noticing? How many moments had passed where Lois or Brian or even Peter had unknowingly stitched threads of safety into the background of his life? So much of his world had been shaped by reaction, by the need to control, to escape, to define himself as something other. But now, lying still in the late hush of the house, he wondered, what if some parts of him had been shaped by quiet kindnesses too, unspoken, overlooked, but real, the kind you only feel when everything else stops. He blinked slowly. The corners of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, just a softness. His fingers ran along the edge of Rupert's arm, tracing the same seam he'd worn down over years. He could feel the slight looseness there, the spot where stuffing had thinned from countless squeezes. Comfort had a texture, and this one was familiar. His eyes began to flutter. But just before they closed, he whispered, voice barely audible, "You're still here." Whether he meant Rupert or that memory of Lois or simply himself, he didn't specify. Maybe he didn't know. And it didn't matter, because in that moment, all of it was true. There was a pause in the air, the kind you only notice when everything aligns for just a breath, like the house was holding itself still, not to disturb him. The night didn't rush. Neither did the quiet. And as sleep finally gathered him like a tide, something shifted, not outwardly, but deep, deep within. A seed planted. A question softened. A beginning where once there had only been armor. He dreamed again. But this time, it wasn't fields or invention trees or glowing shadows. It was simpler. He was in the kitchen. Daylight spilled across the floor in long rectangles. Brian sat at the table, paw lazily wrapped around a mug of coffee. Peter was eating cereal straight from the box. Meg scribbled in a journal. Chris was humming to himself while buttering a waffle. And Lois? She was at the sink, laughing at something Peter had said. Her hands wet with soap, sleeves pushed up, hair tied back, tired eyes, but smiling. Stewie was just there, on the floor, surrounded by building blocks. No death rays, no ticking timers. Just a quiet morning. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to, because for once, no one looked through him. Brian met his eyes, tipped his head slightly. Peter offered him the box of cereal, mouthful. Chris waved. Meg rolled her eyes, but not cruelly. Just Meg. And Lois? She turned, drying her hands, and crouched down beside him. What you building today, sweetie? He looked at the blocks, then at her. Nothing, just stacking. She smiled, brushed a curl from his forehead. That's okay, too. And that was it? That was the whole dream. He didn't wake with a gasp or a jolt. Or he drifted upward from it like a balloon let go gently, floating back into consciousness with the softest return. Eyes half-lidded, breath even, still clutching Rupert. Still safe, still whole, and still, impossibly, loved. Not because of what he could do, but because he was. And that, more than any machine or plan or brilliant device, might have been the most powerful truth of all. The hum of the monitor was the only sound in the Griffin house as night settled like a blanket over the sloping rooftops of Spooner Street. Down the hallway, in a room painted with soft hues and toy-cluttered warmth, Stewie lay in his crib, eyes half closed but mind wide awake. The events of the day still buzzed faintly in his head like a dream that refused to fade. His fingers, small but oddly precise, toyed with the edge of his blanket, unconsciously tracing the same pattern over and over, a quiet rhythm of thought. The room was still, but inside Stewie a storm of introspection was rolling across the dim-lit terrain of his mind. He'd spent the afternoon disassembling Rupert and reassembling him with empathy sensors, scavenged from a defunct Furby and a flashlight. It wasn't exactly what he planned when he first began the day, but then again, most of his emotional experiments rarely went to plan. What lingered wasn't frustration. It was something far quieter, a soft ache he didn't want to name. Rupert, newly refurbished, now sat propped against the wall, one button eye blinking erratically in sleep mode. Stewie stared at him. That stuffed bear had seen so many versions of himself, the rage, the laughter, the desperation. And now it seemed the fear, not of failure, but of honesty. He shifted, turning on his side as the mobile above him spun lazily. The figures, a plastic UFO, a rocket, a grinning Saturn, moved in slow, hypnotic loops, casting elongated shadows across the ceiling, shadows that seemed to stretch and sigh in rhythm with his breathing. Somewhere in that turning ceiling galaxy, he imagined versions of himself orbiting. The tyrant, the traveler, the baby genius, the emotional wreck, all of them fragments. And tonight, for the first time in a while, those fragments weren't at war with each other. They were floating together. His latest experiment, the emotional resonance amplifier, had failed to produce measurable results, at least in the way he'd defined results. No gamma spikes, no external feedback loops, no Rupert tears. But internally, something had shifted. He'd stood in front of the mirror after the test, watching his reflection closely. waiting for some sign of the old Stewie to reappear. The scowl, the sneer, the monologue. None came. Instead, there had only been silence and an odd sense of calm, like the moment after a thunderstorm, when the air tastes new. He hadn't quite known what to make of that, and yet, as the hours passed, that quiet settled into him like a lullaby that no one had ever sung aloud. Something familiar yet unreachable. Downstairs, the television flickered, low-volume static murmuring like an ocean from far away. Lois had fallen asleep on the couch, probably with a wine glass half full and a blanket tossed over her legs. Peter was likely passed out next to her, mouth open, a snack bowl resting on his chest like some forgotten crown. The world continued in its absurd rhythm, never quite noticing that the smallest member of the household was undergoing something close to revelation. Stewie sat up in the crib, resting his arms on the edge. The house was breathing the old wooden panels sighing, the heater clicking into life. It was a rhythm he'd known since birth, and yet tonight it felt new, not because it changed, but because he had. He reached for his journal, a thick red sketch pad tucked beneath his blanket. Its pages were filled with intricate blueprints, plans for world domination, revenge fantasies, and lately soft pencil sketches of faces, his own, his family's, Rupert's, of course, and one he didn't quite recognize, a version of himself, eyes closed, smiling faintly. He traced that face now, fingers gliding gently over the pencil lines. He hadn't meant to draw it. It had just appeared one evening, almost as if the version of him who could rest, who could let go, had surfaced and left a footprint. That drawing had stayed with him like a memory that hadn't happened yet. Something creaked. A floorboard. Probably Chris raiding the fridge again. But Stewie didn't flinch. Not tonight. He simply laid back down, journal pressed to his chest, listening to the way the house exhaled. In his mind, the mobile still turned. He imagined those plastic stars slowly morphing into real constellations. He pictured each version of himself assigned to a star, all drifting in unison. There was no shouting, no monologues, no time machines erupting in sparks. Just orbiting, just existing. Rupert blinked once, then again, then went still. Stewie smiled softly and pulled the blanket higher. The experiment hadn't failed. It had simply redefined the outcome. He hadn't amplified emotion. He'd found a way to feel it without breaking. The blueprint for world domination might have to wait. For tonight, he was content building something far quieter. A space inside himself where all the pieces could rest. And so he closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the house wrap around him, letting the silence speak back in tones he could finally understand. The shadows on the wall shifted gently as the night wore on, and for the first time in a long while, Stewie Griffin allowed himself to simply drift. The drifting began slowly. Not just the kind of drift that sleep brings, but something deeper, a floating away from the rigid need to prove, to dominate, to be something. The pages of Stewie's journal shifted slightly in the faint breath of the heater's hum, and under the blanket of moonlight that washed over the nursery, the line between the baby genius and the little boy softened into near invisibility. He dreamt of quiet things, not of global conquest or interdimensional escape, but of simple scenes, running barefoot through the garden with Brian, a silent nod from Lois as she tucked him in, a dinner table with laughter instead of tension. For once, his subconscious chose warmth over chaos. It was unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. The door creaked open ever so slightly. A shadow leaned in Brian, his eyes barely open, trotting up to the crib, not because he needed anything, but because he sensed something different. The usual static that vibrated around Stewie, that low hum of manic energy, was gone, replaced by a softness. Brian watched him for a moment, ears tilted. Stewie stirred in his sleep, one hand still resting on the journal as if guarding it. Brian lay down beside the crib, letting out a sigh. No words exchanged. Just two friends existing in shared stillness. There had been so many nights filled with banter, with arguments, with whiskey and meaningless philosophy. And yet, this silence somehow felt truer than all of it. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time slowed down when it wasn't being watched. Downstairs, the old clock ticked in even beats, and upstairs the night swayed gently in its cradle of domestic noise. The world didn't care that Stewie was changing. It didn't pause to witness the flickering shift in his emotional circuitry. But Brian did, even in sleep, especially in sleep. The mobile above the crib spun slower now, not from lack of motion, but because it didn't need to rush. Stewie's breath fell into rhythm with the spinning plastic stars, and in that steady breath lay something he hadn't known he was looking for. Peace. But dreams are rarely linear. In the haze of slumber, memories began to rearrange themselves, not as flashbacks, but as reinterpretations. Moments he once relived with resentment now played differently. He remembered Lois dropping his lunchbox one day he'd cursed her under his breath, furious. But now, in this version, he noticed her hands were shaking. She was trying to do 10 things at once. He hadn't seen that before. Another memory. Peter barging in and wrecking a delicate invention. Stewie had screamed, kicked, sworn revenge. But now he saw Peter's face as it happened, goofy, yes, but unaware, not malicious. Just a big kid trying to be present in a world moving too fast for him. The dreams reassembled themselves, not to rewrite history, but to reveal its softer truths. Stewie had been too busy building walls to notice that some doors were already open. All he had to do was walk through them. Even the darker memories, moments of fear, of confusion, of rejection, took on a new shape. They no longer loomed. They no longer defined him. They simply existed, part of a broader mosaic, not the whole picture, just a few tiles in a much more colorful pattern. His body turned slightly under the blanket, and the journal slid from his grip, landing quietly beside him. A sketch spilled open a drawing of Brian and Stewie on a bench sharing a milkshake. It wasn't stylized or dramatic. It was just them, existing. The heater gave one last click before falling silent for the night. Outside, a soft breeze carried the rustle of tree leaves. The world was gently folding itself inward, preparing for rest. Stewie's mind, even in sleep, clung to one last question. Had all this time his greatest invention been hiding in plain sight? Not a weapon, not a device, but the capacity to feel, to be fragile, to let things in without control. Perhaps, or perhaps, the truth was even simpler. That love, messy, annoying, inconvenient love, was the only force powerful enough to keep him grounded. That the family he so often sought to escape was, paradoxically, the only constant that held him together. Even if they never understood his language, even if they never saw the schematics in his head, they showed up, and that mattered. Brian shifted in his sleep, curling up tighter. A murmur escaped him, half a bark, half a yawn. He didn't open his eyes, but he knew Stewie was still there, and more importantly, present. Up in the ceiling, the stars above the crib had stopped spinning altogether, suspended mid-twirl, but the shadows they cast on the wall were still alive, gently waving like dreams. In the silence, nothing happened, and that was everything. Because sometimes the most profound transformation doesn't come with noise or fireworks. It comes quietly, in a crib, in the space between two breaths, in the way a child lets go of a grudge without knowing it, in the soft way sleep settles into bones that have carried too much for too long. And in that silence, Stewie Griffin finally, truly rested.
It was late again, the kind of late that turned the house quiet, not with sleep, but with a peculiar sense of pause, like everything inside was holding its breath. The ticking of the clock in the hallway sounded louder, more deliberate, while a faint hum from the refrigerator downstairs filled the void like background static. Upstairs, nestled under a layer of plush silence, Stewie Griffin sat in his crib, awake. Not restless, not entirely alert either, just humming with thought. His fingers idly tapped the edge of a plush book that lay open beside him, one of those padded ones with soft pages and hidden squeakers. But this one wasn't about animals or alphabet letters. No, Stewie had long since hollowed out its interior, replacing the baby-friendly content with his own entries, observations, hypotheses, dreams, failures. He wasn't tired, not really. His body was still, his eyes heavy-lidded but sharp. What kept him from sleeping tonight was not a plan or even a secret. It was a memory, a glitch, a little something that had happened days earlier, lodged in the back of his mind like a pebble in a shoe. Brian had said something strange, something he wasn't supposed to say. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't sarcasm. It was too sincere for either of those. They had been walking through the park, Stewie in a stroller, Brian pushing him absent-mindedly while narrating the mundane details of his latest failed date. The usual. But then came the part that didn't quite fit. Brian, while reflecting on loneliness, had suddenly said, "I think sometimes you build these little gadgets because it's the only way you feel in control." It was quiet afterward, no follow-up, just a shared silence broken eventually by the rustle of leaves and the bark of a distant dog. But the line remained, echoing. Why did it linger so much? Not because it was wrong. Maybe it was too right. Now, in the comfort of his lair, the reconfigured crib turned command center, the blinking lights on the baby monitor repurposed into an alert system. Stewie stared into the quiet. The room smelled faintly of baby powder and graphite. Rupert sat at his side, unmoving and eternal as ever. His button eyes reflected the soft glow from Stewie's console like distant moons. Tonight wasn't about domination. It wasn't about conquest or clever gadgets or time travel loopholes. Tonight, Stewie wanted to know, why? Why did he feel most alive when building things no one else understood? Why did his heart slow, calm, settle, when the gears clicked just right, when the electrons danced to his tune, when anything worked the way he designed it to? Was it power? Was it escape? Or was it something else, something he didn't have the language for yet? He rolled over onto his back, fingers clasped on his chest like a small philosopher king, gazing up at the glow-in-the-dark stars on his ceiling. They were crooked, placed in a rush months ago. The moon sticker had begun to peel at one corner. When he was younger, which, by Stewie's standard, meant 2 months ago, he had dreams of burning it all down. The system, the rules, the baby gate at the top of the stairs. Now he found himself wondering not what he wanted to destroy, but what he wanted to build. The floorboards outside creaked faintly. A late trip to the bathroom? Lois checking in? No, it was Chris. His heavy-footed shuffle was unmistakable. Stewie listened as the footsteps paused by his door, then moved on without opening it. There was something oddly comforting about that. He swung his legs over the edge of the crib. Technically, he wasn't allowed to get out on his own, but technically, he had disassembled the security latch last week and replaced it with a retractable ramp of his own design. With a faint mechanical hum, the side of the crib retracted, and he slid down silently onto the carpet. The carpet was cool underfoot, not cold, but textured real, the kind of thing that grounded him. He padded softly toward his hidden shelf, the one behind the alphabet blocks that nobody had touched since Meg tried to rearrange them in a fit of rebellion. There, hidden behind a pull-out volume of Baby's First Words, was his sketchbook. Not the blueprints one, the other one. The one he didn't let anyone see. The one he only used when he couldn't sleep and thoughts spun like satellites in his head. He opened it to the latest page. The drawing wasn't of a weapon. It wasn't even of a machine. It was of the family. Crude, yes. His fine motor control still had its limitations. But Lois was unmistakable, drawn with a triangular dress and that eternal tired smile. Peter loomed with an overlarge stomach and crossed eyes. Chris, mid-chicken nugget. Meg, drawn without much attention. Brian, as a blob with a collar. And there, in the middle, Stewie himself, arms wide, not holding anything, not shouting, just there, present, small, but central. What did it mean? He didn't know. But he closed the book softly, tucked it back, and sat down cross-legged beside it. Not because there was anything to do, but because sometimes doing nothing with intention was the bravest act of all. He rested his head against Rupert, the steady, quiet plush of him anchoring something unspoken inside. Outside, a breeze tapped the window. A car passed. The house settled deeper into its hush. And there, in the still glow of half-sleep, Stewie let himself simply exist. Time didn't move the way it usually did in this hush. Seconds stretched like taffy, drawing out the in-betweens of breath, the soft give of memory, the rhythm of a thought repeating just out of reach. Stewie blinked slowly, then not at all. He wasn't asleep, not yet, but his body had softened, slackened into a kind of thoughtful stillness, like he was listening to something beneath the surface noise. Maybe it was the house breathing. Maybe it was himself. Somewhere down the hall, Peter's snore rolled through the quiet like a bear shifting in hibernation. It used to bother Stewie. It used to make his eye twitch, that thunderous disregard for serenity. But now it was familiar, predictable, almost soothing in its certainty. A sonic signpost that everything was as it should be, as chaotic and unhinged as that might be. He allowed his eyes to drift to the corner of the room, where a small toy rocket stood upright, cobbled together from spare parts and adhesive hope. It was never meant to fly. Not really. It had no propulsion system, no stabilizers, just imagination holding it upright. But there was something honest in that, a model of dreams too fragile for flight. He remembered the night he built it. Not a night like this that one had been filled with frustration. He'd failed a recalibration test on the mind control tiara, and the frequency matrix had overloaded. There were sparks, burned toast, a temporary blackout that Lois blamed on faulty wiring. He was furious, his usual sense of competence cracked open. So he built the rocket instead. Not to go anywhere, not to prove anything, just to make something that didn't need to work. He found comfort in that memory now. There was a time he wouldn't have. Stewie rubbed his thumb over the seam in Rupert's arm, the stitching slightly frayed. He could fix it, of course, had the tools, the thread, the precision, but part of him liked it that way. Imperfect. Lived in. Honest. Funny how he spent so much time pretending to be older than he was, using big words, plotting big things, feigning detachment when so much of his quiet joy came from moments just like this. The hush, the soft light, the shadows stretching like stories across the wall. He remembered something else then, a smaller memory, buried deep. He was even younger, maybe a few weeks, maybe a lifetime. Lois had been humming to him, some half melody that didn't belong to any song, and he'd felt weightless. Not because he didn't know anything, but because he hadn't started pretending yet. He hadn't yet chosen to wear masks. He was just a baby then. No personas, no plans, just breath and heartbeat and the safe, slow rock of someone who cared. He hadn't thought about that in a long time. He shifted slightly, curling his legs beneath him, the softness of the carpet pressing into his knees. His hand rested on Rupert's belly. The stuffed bear, worn and unblinking, seemed to say nothing but understand everything. "Do you think there's a version of me that never picked up a wrench?" he whispered. Not in a sad way, just curious. A version that just played with blocks, bit fingers, slept through the night? Rupert, of course, said nothing, but silence in this moment felt like permission to keep thinking. Would that version of Stewie be happier? Would he still feel that itch behind the thoughts? That drive to do something different? To push further? To break apart the obvious in search of something better? Or would he be content? Stewie let out a soft breath. Not quite a sigh. Not quite relief. Just the kind of breath that says, I'm here. Still. He turned his head and looked toward the bookshelf low and filled with titles far above his supposed reading level. Dostoevsky tucked between Goodnight Moon and Pat the Bunny, a few manuals on quantum computing wedged beside pop-up books. No one ever noticed. Or maybe they did and chose not to ask. Sometimes he liked to imagine that Brian had seen the titles and just decided to let him have that little rebellion in peace. Maybe that was what Brian had meant. About control. It wasn't about needing to rule the world. It was about needing the world to make sense. About finding ways to hold chaos in your hand like a marble and say, you don't get to spin without me watching. He liked that idea. It didn't make him weak. It made him aware. That was different. The night was folding deeper around the house now. Even the street lights outside seemed to dim slightly, like they too were ready to give in to the dark. Stewie climbed back into his crib, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The plush mattress welcomed him like a secret. He adjusted the corner of his blanket, pulling it just over his toes and turned onto his side. Rupert was in his arms before he even noticed. His eyes wandered to the digital readout on the side panel, his own creation, of course. It tracked time, temperature, heart rate, motion, even dreams if you asked it nicely. Right now, it blinked a soft teal. All vitals normal. No anomalies. Peace. Quantified. His eyelids fluttered once. Twice. There was no grand revelation. No final twist. No dramatic realization. Just a quiet room, a quiet boy, and the long, soft exhale of a day turning gently toward sleep. And for now, that was enough. The room was still. Not just quiet, but perfectly still. The kind of stillness that settles only when something has passed. A storm, a realization, a memory unburied. Stewie lay on his side, eyes half-lidded. The weight of his own thoughts tucked somewhere behind the curve of his skull. And though he didn't move, something inside him had ever so slightly shifted. Outside, the night wasn't quite done humming. Somewhere, a cricket misjudged the hour and chirped once before falling silent again. The glow from the hallway spilled faintly through the crack in the door, casting a warm line across the crib bars like the thinnest of golden bridges. Stewie stared at it. For a moment, it looked like a path. Not to somewhere else, but into the quiet marrow of his own mind, into the tangled softness of dreams where the real thoughts lived. Not the loud ones. Not the ones you could explain. The ones that whispered just beneath knowing. He blinked again. Not because he needed to, but because blinking gave things rhythm. Rupert's fur brushed his arm. He could feel every thread of it, the little ridges where stuffing had shifted slightly with time. There was something comforting about that. The imperfections, the wear. It was like being reminded that some things were loved enough to fray. His thoughts slid back to Brian. He hadn't meant to say anything that afternoon when the dog had caught him watching old film reels in the basement. But Brian had stayed, hadn't asked too many questions, just leaned against a dusty shelf and let the reel spin. No commentary, no jokes, just presence. It had meant something, more than Stewie had let on. He wondered now what Brian was doing. Probably asleep, maybe dreaming, or maybe just staring at the ceiling, tracing invisible lines across it with that odd, quiet loneliness he wore like a second skin. It occurred to Stewie, not for the first time, that Brian understood him more than anyone else. Not completely, of course, no one could do that, but enough. Enough to let silence be a language. Enough to stay. Stewie pulled the blanket up higher, the softness of it brushing his chin. There was a hum in his head, not unpleasant. Just the slow, low buzz of thoughts winding down, stacking themselves neatly like books on a shelf. He thought of the time he tried to recreate a memory in the lab. Not just recall it, recreate it. He'd built a simulation module, fed it brainwave patterns, sensory data, heart rate spikes, everything he could track from the moment he first tasted peanut butter. A dumb little thing. But it had made him laugh, purely, unexpectedly. That was what he'd tried to reproduce. But the result had been close, but not right. Like a song played a key too high. Familiar, but hollow. He'd shut the simulation down after a few seconds and gone upstairs without saying anything. But now, lying here in the softness of half sleep, he realized why it hadn't worked. Because joy doesn't live in the data. It lives in the surprise, in the moment you didn't plan for. The glitch, the spill, the unintentional sparkle in something mundane. And that was the paradox, wasn't it? The more he tried to control it, the more he buried the very thing he was chasing. His fingers absently traced a seam in the blanket, as if following a road on a map he didn't quite understand. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the point wasn't to understand everything. Maybe it was just to notice. The way light curved differently around the crib bars at night. The faint echo of the TV downstairs before Lois remembered to turn it off. The way Brian always paused for a second before saying goodnight, as if weighing whether to add something more. The smallest things. The ones too quiet to hear when you were busy plotting your way out of your own story. He turned over slightly, nestling deeper into the crib. His body was tired now. Not from running or lifting or building, but from thinking. The good kind of tired. The kind that comes when you've turned over a thought enough times to smooth its edges. He thought briefly of his clones. Those poor, dim copies he'd made of himself in a fit of efficiency. They were gone now, had been for some time. But sometimes, in the silence, he wondered if any part of them lingered. Not physically, but conceptually. Like footprints in sand, long blown away by wind, but remembered by the shore. They hadn't lasted, couldn't. They were fragments without anchor. And wasn't that the lesson? You couldn't cut pieces of yourself and expect them to carry the whole. You couldn't outsource emotion, bottle awareness, or delegate pain. You had to carry it. All of it. He shifted again, the blanket rustling softly. The crib creaked a little under the weight redistribution. A soft wooden yawn. In the next room, Meg turned over in her sleep. He could hear the faint squeak of her mattress springs. Funny how the house kept revealing itself to those who listened. The floors talked, the pipes grumbled, the walls sighed in temperature shifts. This was his world. Messy, loud, exhausting. But real, and in its own way, beautiful. A tiny yawn escaped him before he even realized it was coming. His eyes blinked slower now, the world softening at the edges like watercolor on wet paper. For just a moment, he imagined what it would be like to let go entirely. To stop fighting, stop proving, stop planning. Just be, just for one night. He imagined floating, not flying, just floating in a warm sea of thought, weightless, untethered, free from the gravity of expectation. No inventions, no genius, no conquest. Just drifting through the calm, the soft hush of being. It was tempting. More tempting than he'd admit if asked. But no one was asking. Not tonight. Tonight, the only question was whether to keep thinking or to let the thinking dissolve. Sleep didn't arrive all at once. It never did. For Stewie, it came like fog drifting through an open window, not unwelcome, just unnoticed until everything was covered in it. His mind no longer chased thoughts, it watched them. Noticing like someone standing on the platform as trains passed without boarding any of them. He didn't dream immediately. First came the drift, the soft stretch of imagination unbound by structure, where one idea slipped into the next like shadows across fabric. He was in the kitchen, then the park, then somewhere that looked like neither. A space made of colors and warmth, and the sensation of being held. Held. That was it, wasn't it? The thing he didn't talk about. The thing beneath the layers of cleverness, the arsenal of sarcasm and superiority. He wanted to be held, not just physically, emotionally, mentally. He wanted someone to stay long enough to see the parts of him that didn't speak. Brian had come close enough that Stewie often didn't know whether to thank him or push him away harder, because closeness felt like exposure, like standing without armor. But now in this space between thought and dream, that didn't scare him. It felt safe. He imagined himself smaller, not just in body, but in burden. A version of himself that didn't need to prove anything. A version that could cry if he wanted to, or laugh too loud, or ask for help without calculating how it would be interpreted. He imagined Lois noticing him. Not in passing, not as a schedule or a bottle or a responsibility, but as someone with quiet depths. Someone who didn't just take up space, but filled it with something fragile and important. Maybe she did notice, sometimes, in those small moments when her hand lingered a second longer, or when her voice softened mid-sentence. Maybe she didn't know what to say, so she didn't. And maybe he did the same. Connection could be clumsy like that. His thoughts hovered there, not heavy, not light, just present, like the steady hum of a ceiling fan. He felt the weight of Rupert beside him, comforting in its stillness. That bear had seen more than anyone. Adventures, meltdowns, quiet confessions spoken aloud under the illusion of play. Rupert had been his sounding board, his witness, his co-conspirator. But also, Rupert had been his proof. Proof that Stewie still wanted something soft. That despite all his threats and plans and declarations of power, there was a part of him that never gave up on love. Not romantic, not familial, just honest love. The kind that didn't need to be impressive or loud. The kind that simply stayed. A breeze tapped the window pane. Not cold, just present. The kind of touch that reminded you the world was still turning out there. That dawn would come, whether you were ready or not, and that somehow there was comfort in that inevitability. In the crib, Stewie's breathing slowed. His chest rose and fell like tidewater, in sync with the quiet rhythm of a house at rest. No one needed him right now. Not as a genius, not as a villain, not even as a son. He could just be. A small boy with big thoughts, finding peace in the silence between them. And in that silence, another memory came. One he hadn't summoned, but welcomed. It was from weeks ago, a quiet night much like this one. He had walked past the bathroom where Lois stood brushing her hair. She didn't see him, but in the mirror she looked tired not just from chores, but from everything. Life, expectations, the invisible weight women carried so gracefully it was often mistaken for lightness. And then she'd smiled. At nothing. Just a small, real smile that folded softly into her reflection, like a secret between versions of herself. Stewie had paused. Not because he understood it, but because he wanted to. That was the first time he realized he didn't have Lois figured out. Not entirely. Not even close. She was full of stories he didn't know, memories he hadn't witnessed, and feelings he didn't yet have the language for. But somehow, that didn't make her distant. It made her human. He thought of that now, as sleep finally gathered at the edges of him, like a blanket tucked in by invisible hands. There were things he didn't understand, about his family, about himself, about why he sometimes felt like both the observer and the one being watched. But for once, that didn't feel like failure. It felt like a beginning. He was drifting now, fully, dreams edging in, not with plot, but with mood, warmth, stillness, safe space. A piano played somewhere not real, just in his head. A few soft notes repeating. Simple, unfinished. Like a lullaby he was writing inside a dream. And in the very last conscious corner of his mind before surrendering to the deep, a thought settled in like dust on a windowsill. He would be okay. Not because he had solved anything, not because he had won, but because for the first time he had stopped running. And in that stillness, he had found something stronger than control. He had found rest. It was past midnight now in the Griffin household. The television had long flickered into static in the living room. Even Peter, who often fell asleep snacking on the couch, had retreated into a haze of dreams involving beer fountains and chicken fights. But up in the nursery, Stewie remained quietly restless, nestled beneath his comforter like a slumbering storm. The soft hum of the baby monitor, the occasional rustle of leaves outside his window, and the tick of the wall clock were the only companions to his whirring thoughts. There was a rhythm to his stillness, one leg twitching slightly under the blanket, his fingers curled just a little too tightly around Rupert. He wasn't asleep, not fully, not yet. He drifted in a space between minds swirling with residual echoes of the day's events. Lois had kissed his forehead before bed and called him my little genius. And though she'd said it 1,000 times before, tonight it felt different. He hadn't corrected her. He hadn't plotted revenge. He had simply accepted the gesture and closed his eyes. But now, those eyes opened slowly, glowing faintly in the moonlight. A small frown pulled at his lips. His dreams had been odd, vivid, a montage of memories layered atop projections of who he might become. One dream had shown him standing on stage at a TED Talk, dazzling a crowd with quantum theories. Another saw him running a toy empire from a skyscraper shaped like his head. Yet another had him in a warm home, older, softer, holding a real baby of his own. He'd cradled it with wonder and confusion, unsure of how to feel. What disturbed Stewie wasn't the diversity of these futures. It was that he'd liked them, each of them, even the boring domestic one. As if summoned by his thoughts, Rupert rolled slightly under his arm. Stewie glanced down at the bear, his brow furrowing. "You're quiet tonight," he whispered. "Too quiet. Usually by now you've taken on the voice of Orson Welles in my subconscious and started lecturing me about grandiosity." The bear said nothing, of course, just sat there with his button eyes reflecting the faint silver moonlight. With a quiet sigh, Stewie slipped out of bed and padded across the floor. He didn't bother turning on the lights his night vision had adapted from countless sneaky missions. He opened a drawer in his toy chest and pulled out the thin notebook hidden beneath a pile of blocks. It wasn't labeled, just a leather-bound journal filled with half-sketched blueprints, emotional breakdown charts, and scribbled monologues. He opened it to a recent page and stared. There it was, the timeline of Project Me, a plan he'd devised to identify, isolate, and eliminate conflicting emotions that interfered with his ambition. The last few entries, however, were troubling. Hesitation after mother's praise, unexpected fondness for Brian's approval, softening toward Meg, laughter at Peter's dance, concerning. The word concerning had been underlined 3 times and circled, but instead of devising a solution, the page just ended. That's where he'd stopped. He traced a finger down the margin, then closed the book. Stewie had long believed emotions were obstacles, illogical variables that disrupted the pursuit of power. But what if they were clues instead? Not flaws to be eliminated, but fragments of something deeper he hadn't fully unlocked? That thought lingered like a mist in the room, hovering over his tiny figure. Down the hall, Brian's collar clinked faintly. Stewie turned his head, listening. Then on instinct, he padded silently toward the door and opened it just enough to peek out. No lights, just shadows stretching long along the hallway carpet. He stepped out, the floor cool beneath his feet. Past the bathroom, past Chris's room. He reached Brian's door and pushed it open gently. Brian was asleep, or pretending to be. A book lay open on his chest, something about existentialism, if the cover was to be believed. Typical, but the soft snoring betrayed a more peaceful interior. Stewie stood there for a long moment, uncertain. Then he whispered, "Do you think I'm broken, Brian?" There was no answer, only the hum of the house breathing. "Yeah, thought not." He closed the door and returned to his room, his steps slower now. The world felt heavier, as if his inner shifts had recalibrated gravity itself. Back in his crib, he didn't lie down right away. He sat against the side rail and stared at the ceiling, where those glow-in-the-dark stars still clung from a year ago. Some were peeling now, curling at the edges, but they still shone. He remembered putting them up with Lois. She'd let him pick where each constellation went, and he'd done it with exacting precision, naturally. He hadn't realized how meaningful that memory was until now. Eventually, his eyes began to close, but not from exhaustion, from something softer, something resembling peace. He curled around Rupert again, and this time, he whispered something different. "You know what's terrifying, old pal? I think I'm starting to like who I'm becoming, even if it means I'll never build a death ray again. Well, maybe just a small one." A faint chuckle escaped him, then silence. Somewhere in his dreams that night, Stewie Griffin stood alone in the command center of his mind screens blinking. Lights dimmed, warning systems offline. He approached the central console and laid a hand on it, not to launch anything, but to listen. And for the first time, the console pulsed back, not with data or alarms, but with a heartbeat. Slow, steady, human. A vast chamber filled with archived memories lit up softly. Laughs, cries, hugs, fights, failures. Each moment filed away, now seen in a new light. A gallery of growing pains. A museum of meaning. He walked through it not with disdain, but wonder. Somewhere deeper, a version of himself smaller, quieter reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. When he awoke the next morning, the house was still quiet. But something in him had shifted. He didn't jump out of bed to scheme or conquer. Instead, he listened. Birds outside, Peter fumbling with the toaster, Meg sighing, Brian stretching, and Lois humming. He smiled. "Let's see what today brings," he muttered, rolling out of bed with no weapon, no gadget, just a yawn. It was the first mission he'd launched that didn't have a plan. And somehow that made it more exciting than any invasion or invention ever could. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the Griffin household with the kind of quiet determination Stewie usually loathed. But today its warmth didn't irritate him the way it usually did. It wrapped the room in a slow glow, brushing over the wooden floor and casting soft stripes across Rupert's fuzzy face. The bear was still tucked beside him, its stitched expression unchanging. But now Stewie didn't feel the need to project monologues onto it. The silence between them felt fine, peaceful even. He blinked slowly, adjusting to the calm, the kind that didn't beg for a plan or a weapon or a vendetta, the kind of calm that stretched across his thoughts like a blanket, just warm enough to make him pause. His body wasn't tense, his mind wasn't racing. For once, he didn't wake up with the impulse to check the hidden console behind the changing table or scan for motion in the hallway. Just stillness. Below, he could hear the house beginning to stir. The clatter of Peter rummaging through the fridge, the creak of Lois stepping onto the kitchen tile, Chris's loud footsteps in the hallway, and Meg, always the early riser, despite having nothing to do, shuffling through a drawer for headphones that never seemed to be where she left them. All of it was so typical, so boring, so comforting. And Stewie realized he wasn't annoyed by it. He sat up slowly, pushing aside the blanket, and glanced toward the window. A breeze tickled the curtain. The leaves outside shimmered under a soft golden shimmer, and for a fleeting second, Stewie wondered what it might be like to walk through the backyard barefoot, without a tracking device buried in the grass, or a cloaking field humming just beneath the surface. Just a walk, no plan, no pressure, just being. It was a bizarre thought for someone who once designed a weather dominator disguised as a lawn sprinkler. But here it was, and he didn't reject it. He slid out of bed, careful not to wake Rupert. Not because the bear could hear him, but because it somehow felt like part of the ritual. A private moment kept intact. He tiptoed to the dresser and pulled out a sweater, a soft, powder blue one Lois had given him on a whim. Even though he insisted he preferred monochromatic tactical wear, he looked at it now and didn't roll his eyes. He just pulled it over his head. He was halfway to the door when he stopped, turned back, and looked at his room, really looked at it. The mobile above his crib, the stack of picture books he pretended not to care about, the toy blocks he arranged into elaborate structures, and then casually demolished. It was more than a base of operations. It was a timeline, a trail of fragments from a version of himself he hadn't fully accepted until now. He walked out. Downstairs, the kitchen buzzed with early morning dysfunction. Peter was arguing with the toaster, which had apparently taken offense at his frozen waffles. Lois moved around him like a practiced ballet dancer, pouring juice, flipping eggs, answering Chris's questions about gym class, and gently reminding Meg to stop playing death metal at the table. It was a familiar chaos, but today Stewie felt oddly outside of it, not disconnected, just observant. Brian patted in behind him with that usual sleepy stretch, yawning like he'd been up all night reading Camus again. Well, well, he muttered as he glanced down at Stewie. The little warlord rises. Stewie tilted his head. Funny. I was just thinking how much quieter the mornings would be without you breathing over your coffee like you've solved despair. Brian raised a brow. You're in a good mood. Or, Stewie said, walking past him toward the fridge, you're just less annoying today. Lois turned, pleasantly surprised. Stewie, sweetie, you want some eggs? He blinked once, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. Sure, he said after a pause. Scrambled, not too dry. Lois nodded, returning to the skillet. Coming right up. Peter popped his toaster-free waffle into his mouth and gave Stewie a thumbs up. Way to join the rest of us, little dude. Stewie sat at the table without protest, folding his hands in front of him. The silence stretched again, not uncomfortable, just full. Something about being seated at the same table as the rest of them, without an internal countdown or a blueprint scrolling across his mental field of vision, it felt significant. Meg glanced at him from across the table. You okay? Stewie turned to her, then nodded. I think so. She blinked. Huh. Brian poured himself coffee, then leaned against the counter, watching Stewie closely. Something shift in the matrix? Possibly. Stewie didn't look up. Or maybe. I've just recalibrated. Brian took a sip. That sounds like something you'd say before launching an orbital strike. Tempting, Stewie murmured, but today I'm considering a different kind of offensive strategy. One involving breakfast. Lois smiled as she placed a small plate in front of him. There you go, honey. He looked down at the scrambled eggs, steam rising gently. Then up at Lois. Thank you. Her eyes widened slightly, then softened. You're welcome, Stewie. The morning continued, unremarkable in all the ways that mattered. And yet beneath the surface of casual chatter and clinking silverware, something in Stewie continued to shift. A quiet bloom of awareness. Not the mechanical efficiency he'd prized for so long. Not the cold, calculated precision of his usual scheming. This was something warmer, slower. Like realizing the rhythm of the family he once viewed as obstacles was in fact the only rhythm that truly grounded him. After breakfast, he wandered into the backyard. Not with blueprints, not to install sensors, just to be there. The grass was damp with dew, the kind that soaked through his socks within seconds. He didn't care. The sun crept higher, birds chirped with annoying optimism, and a breeze tugged gently at the sleeves of his sweater. It was a different kind of quiet out here, not sterile or tactical. Natural. He sat under the tree near the fence, the one Peter had crashed through once on a tricycle. From this angle, the house looked like a real home, not just a base of operations. A warm, messy, lived-in space where chaos was a given and love was the undercurrent that held it all together. He lay back against the grass, arms behind his head, and stared up at the clouds. One of them looked vaguely like Rupert. Another looked like a blueprint he'd once drafted for a baby-sized mech suit. But instead of cataloging cloud formations or mentally calculating wind speed, he just watched. He didn't realize he was smiling until he heard Brian approach. You look ridiculous, the dog said, tail swishing lazily. Good, Stewie said without opening his eyes. I intend to look even more ridiculous before the day's over. Perhaps I'll finger paint. Brian lay down beside him. You've gone soft. Temporarily, Stewie replied. Call it an experiment. Brian let out a slow, dog-sized sigh, the kind only a sentient creature with too much philosophy in his blood could produce. So what's this experiment testing? Whether your circuits overheat if you experience contentment for too long? Stewie's eyes still tracked the clouds lazily. I'm testing a theory that perhaps I don't have to be at war with the world to still exist meaningfully in it. Whoa, Brian murmured. That's actually kind of profound. I know, Stewie said, his voice half a whisper. It's irritating. They both lay there in silence for a while. The birds above didn't care. The wind had no opinion. The world just kept going, utterly unfazed by Stewie Griffin's internal revolution. And strangely, that made it easier to process, easier to accept. I think, Stewie began, barely above a breath, that I was so terrified of fading into the background, of becoming a forgotten accessory in a chaotic household, that I built this image of myself, a genius villain, a misunderstood conqueror. I wasn't just performing, I was clinging. Brian nodded slowly. And now? Stewie turned his head, looking at Brian. Now, I'm not sure that I need the performance to matter. Maybe I matter just because I'm here. Brian looked at him with a rare softness, the kind reserved for those fleeting moments when sarcasm didn't serve. That's probably the most adult thing you've ever said. Well, it's been a long time coming, Stewie murmured, tilting his head back toward the sky. You know, I used to watch the clouds and imagine dropping precision payloads from stealth drones shaped like kites. Of course you did. But today, I just see clouds. The breeze carried the smell of cut grass and something vaguely floral. Perhaps the neighbor's garden was blooming again, or maybe Lois had switched to lavender fabric softener. Either way, it anchored the moment. Small sensory details knitting together the landscape of this fragile piece. Eventually, Brian sat up and stretched. You want to head in? You've been lying in the grass like an indie film protagonist for a while. Not yet, Stewie said. Let's just stay. Brian didn't argue. He lay back down beside him, the two of them side by side in silence, their shadows stretching gently across the lawn. And in that hush, Stewie thought about all the versions of himself he had once been. The hyper-intellectual saboteur, the time-traveling egotist, the sentimental sibling he buried beneath sarcasm. He realized that those weren't separate people. They were all him, different shades of the same palette. And now something more had joined the mix, a willingness to exist without armor. Inside the house, the day carried on. Peter undoubtedly attempted to fix something that wasn't broken. Chris played loud video games while Meg grumbled in the background. Lois folded laundry while humming a song from her college years, never quite hitting the right pitch, but somehow always sounding like home. Stewie smiled faintly. His family was a disaster, but it was his disaster, and lately he was starting to feel like a real part of it. Not just a spectator or a saboteur, not just the wild card in the Griffin deck, but a card that belonged. The afternoon waned slowly. Eventually, Stewie stood, brushing the grass from his sweater, and walked back inside. Brian followed at a lazy trot, tail swaying like a metronome. Lois was in the living room, sorting socks by color. She glanced up and smiled. Have a good think outside? I suppose I did, Stewie replied, voice even. You want to help me pair these up? Stewie looked at the mess of mismatched socks, once a battlefield of irritation. Today it looked like a puzzle, a soft, domestic one. Sure, he said, sitting beside her. Let's restore order to the kingdom of hosiery. Lois laughed. That's the spirit. They sorted in companionable silence. Occasionally their hands brushed as they reached for the same sock. Neither commented. Neither pulled away. It felt normal, in the best way. Later that evening, after dinner, in a rare moment of everyone actually sitting at the table at the same time, Stewie padded up to his room. The night had fallen gently, wrapping the house in a velvet hush. He passed Meg in the hallway. She nodded. He nodded back. No eye rolls, no insults, just acknowledgement. It felt like progress. In his room, the air was cool and still. He approached his old console hidden behind the toy chest and opened the panel. The screen lit up with code and schematics, half-finished algorithms, forgotten missions. Plans once born out of loneliness and disconnection. He stared at it for a long while. Then with a soft sigh, he reached out and turned the power off. No dramatics, no final speech, just a quiet decision. He walked to his bed, crawled under the blanket, and reached for Rupert. The bear sat in his usual spot, ever patient, ever still. "You know," Stewie said softly, "we used to need that console like a lifeline. But now, I think I'd rather see what happens when I don't try to control everything." Rupert, of course, said nothing, but his silence felt different now, like agreement. Outside, the wind rustled gently through the trees. Somewhere down the hall, Chris was laughing at a movie, and Lois was humming again. Stewie closed his eyes, letting the sound wrap around him like a lullaby. His breath slowed, his thoughts settled. And for the first time in a long time, he fell asleep without running simulations in his head. No battles, no escape plans. Just dreams. Dreams unshaped by fear. Dreams softened by family. There was no hesitation in Stewie's gait now. His small, firm steps padded softly across the hallway carpet like he'd done this 1,000 times before. He wasn't just returning to his room. He was stepping into something deeper. A world layered not in blueprints or weapons, but in moods, fragments, memories that hung thick in the air like dust caught in twilight. Inside, the lighting had dimmed just slightly, and the old lullaby mobile above his crib swayed gently. Not from wind or motion, but some intangible pull, like a thought left unfinished. He passed by Rupert, who lay exactly where he'd left him, on his side, eyes blank, quietly loyal. But Stewie didn't pick him up. Not this time. His focus was fixed elsewhere. On the far end of the room, where the ceiling met the wall in a soft arc, a new machine stood open and humming faintly. Unlike his usual contraptions, this one bore no hard edges, no gleaming death beams or chrome levers. This machine was round, quiet, nestled in cushions and draped in fabric, as though someone had blended a sensory deprivation tank with a Victorian fainting couch. Its design was soft, like a womb, yet its purpose was far from passive. This was an emotional archive, a device that did not conquer the world, but attempted to catalog it from the inside. He stepped up to it, eyes narrowing, then glanced briefly at a series of lights pulsing along its rim, each a different hue: red, blue, yellow, purple, each one a mood, a memory, a piece of him, extracted, isolated, and replayable. He sighed once, not out of fatigue, but because this step always required surrender. And for someone like Stewie, surrender was harder than time travel. With a practiced motion, he lowered himself into the cushioned seat. His small fingers adjusted a dial just above his head, and immediately the lights dimmed further until the only glow came from inside the chamber. Then the air thickened, the silence grew denser, and the world outside began to melt away. The first memory rolled in without warning. Stewie sitting alone at the foot of the staircase, maybe 2 years old, clutching a broken music box. There had been a party upstairs, laughter, dancing, Lois spinning in circles with Peter as Brian barked in rhythm. But down here in the low light of the hallway, he'd been invisible. Not abandoned, no, just overlooked. No one knew he was watching, and yet he remembered every note of the song, every flicker of light above him, every syllable of laughter that didn't reach his ears. He remembered the heaviness in his chest, not because he was sad, but because he didn't know what sadness was yet. It was simply wait. That sensation pulled back like a tide, and another followed, this time more vivid. Brian, his only real conversation partner, lying on the couch with a book. Stewie sitting beside him with a juice box asking questions, not about the world, but about what made people cry, what made people scream, what made people stay. Brian had chuckled and said something sarcastic, something about how feelings were just chemicals in chaos. Stewie had nodded as if that made sense, But the entire time, something inside had tightened, a knot that never quite came undone. He adjusted the dial again, and this time the room flooded with blue light. A montage played, short clips echoing like underwater recordings. Lois kissing his forehead while he pretended to be asleep. Peter carrying him clumsily through a haunted house, thinking he was protecting him when Stewie was only pretending to be afraid. Meg leaving him a cookie on a napkin during a thunderstorm. Chris calling him a genius when no one else was listening. Each memory arrived soft but sharp, tender yet hollow, like echoes from a song that was never finished. As the images shifted, the machine began to stir. Its hum became more like a whisper, as though it too was trying to understand him. And in that moment, for the first time, Stewie felt not like a scientist in control of a test, but like the experiment himself. His voice, usually clipped and dramatic, sounded smaller when he finally spoke aloud. What am I supposed to do with all this? No one answered, of course. Not the walls, not the lights, not the ghostly memories looping silently around him. But somehow he didn't expect them to. The real answer wasn't something that could be given. It had to be felt. And feeling things was exactly what he'd spent years avoiding. The scene began to swirl now, not from machine error, but from overload. Too many emotions hitting at once, too many rewinds and crossfades. The grief of being misunderstood, the pride of being feared, the ache of wanting someone to truly understand his mind, not just laugh when he made jokes about annihilation. And then came a sudden sharp shift. He was back in the kitchen. Not in reality, but in memory, standing near the fridge as Lois hummed, preparing dinner. He couldn't have been more than a year old, freshly verbal but already armed with wit. He had tried to insult her that day. Something about boiling her own head, but she had only smiled and said, "You're just tired, sweetie." Then she'd lifted him into her arms and held him close. He remembered the heat of her body, the sound of her heartbeat against his tiny ear, the way her breath smelled like cinnamon and something maternal. It had been one of the only times he didn't resist. He just leaned into her shoulder and stayed there, suspended between sarcasm and surrender. That memory hit him harder than the rest, because it wasn't funny, because it wasn't evil, because it was real. The machine crackled softly, bringing him back. He blinked against the light. The images were fading now, the power slowly draining from the chamber, as if it too had reached emotional capacity. He stepped out quietly, barefoot on the cool floor, and stood beside the crib for a long moment. His eyes, still adjusted to the inner light of the machine, scanned the familiar shapes of the room. Plush animals frozen in play, blocks mid-topple, his blueprint scrolls stacked neatly like sacred texts. Rupert sat waiting. Stewie picked him up, but didn't say anything. Instead, he walked over to the far corner, sat down slowly, and leaned back against the wall. Rupert tucked under his arm, his fingers resting on the bear's matted ear like it was a grounding wire. He didn't activate a laser. He didn't mutter a monologue. He simply sat there, eyes drifting half closed, and let the silence seep in. Not the kind of silence that followed an explosion. Not the one that echoed after a sarcastic line, but the kind of silence that whispered, "I'm still figuring it out." And that was enough for now. Outside his window, the sky had turned navy. Not quite night. Not quite morning. A soft wind rustled the leaves beyond the glass, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called out once, as if to remind the world that yes, even geniuses rest sometimes. Even villains. Even Stewie. Night never quite settled in the Griffin household. It hovered instead, like a tentative thought, unsure whether to deepen into sleep or pause and listen. And in that liminal hush, while the rest of the house surrendered to exhaustion in fits and snores and soft mattress sighs, Stewie sat upright in the cradle of his thoughts, Rupert tucked gently against his side, as if guarding the doorway to something sacred. The emotional archive now sat dormant behind him, its hum replaced by a low residual warmth that had settled into the room. That warmth wasn't mechanical. It wasn't even tangible. It was something else, like a knowing presence, the kind that lingers after a hard truth is acknowledged, but not yet spoken aloud. For Stewie, silence had never been neutral. It was a weapon when he wanted it, a canvas, a strategy, and sometimes a confession. Tonight it was something else entirely. A listener. His eyes, half-lidded with fatigue, but sharper than ever, drifted along the dim perimeter of his room. Everything looked the same. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. And not because he'd unlocked some rare emotion or cracked the final piece of the cosmic human puzzle. It was subtler than that. Something had shifted inside, an angle of perception, maybe, a tolerance, or more terrifyingly, a need. He'd always needed control. That was a fact. That was bedrock. But what he hadn't expected, what he couldn't have engineered or planned for, was the ache that bloomed in moments of stillness. The quiet, childlike yearning that followed the realization that some things, love, connection, loss, weren't things to be controlled. They were things to be endured, and sometimes things to be invited. He lay back slowly, easing into the cushioned floor as if it were water. Rupert pressed under his arm like an anchor, and just as his body began to melt into the calm, his mind, predictably, inevitably, did what it always did. It wandered. Not to inventions, not to schemes, but to what might come next. There was a strange itch he couldn't place, like knowing a storm is coming, but feeling only the faintest pressure shift in the air. It wasn't dread, it wasn't anticipation. It was the sense that some invisible boundary inside him had softened, that maybe for the first time the walls weren't just cracking, they were allowing in light. And in that vague opening, memories began to form again. Not machine-fed this time, but organic, alive. They came not as clear visions, but in sensations. The rough texture of Brian's voice when he got too honest. The absurd, uninvited safety of Lois's arms. The thrill of being hated by Peter, and the complex mirror of being occasionally understood by Meg. It was as if each of them had left fingerprints on him, smudges he used to try to scrub away, but which now shimmered faintly in the dark. And then there was Bertram, his half-brother, his nemesis, his mirror in many ways. Stewie thought of him not with anger, but with something closer to regret. Not for the battles or the plots or the time-warping chaos, but for the fact that Bertram had always wanted the same thing, to matter. Just like Stewie, but they'd never said it. Never could. Had Stewie seen a reflection in Bertram he didn't want to confront? Possibly. Had he pushed him away not out of superiority, but out of fear? Almost certainly. But that was behind him now, like a blurry memory through fog glass. Tonight wasn't about battles. It was about boundaries, about watching them soften. As the night deepened and the walls exhaled their warmth, Stewie allowed a rare thing to happen. He let the quiet hold him. Not distract him, not bore him. Just hold. And in that silence, something else shifted. An idea began to grow. Not an idea with schematics or circuits. Not a machine, not a weapon, but a plan of a different kind. Something much more difficult. Something messier. He would begin to speak. Not perform, not threaten. Not declare world domination or sarcastic superiority. He would speak, not to the world, but to his world. To Brian, to Lois, to maybe even Meg. Not with the goal of being understood, but with the intention of being real. That thought alone was terrifying, but also liberating. He stood now, slowly. The motion was gentle, almost reverent. Rupert in hand, he walked toward the window and stared out into the pale blue-black stretch of early morning. Somewhere in that vast distance, a city twinkled. Families slept, people dreamed, some struggled, some healed. And he, Stuart Gilligan Griffin, stood barefoot and blinking, awake in every sense. There was nothing left to prove tonight, no inventions to perfect, no evil schemes to polish, only the hum of a house full of odd love and chaotic dysfunction. And for once, that was enough. He whispered something soft to himself, but not even Rupert heard it. And that's when the house itself seemed to breathe with him. Downstairs, Peter snored in erratic bursts. Meg rolled over in her sheets, the lonely warmth of her nightlight still burning. Chris mumbled something about cereal in his sleep. Brian, curled on the living room couch, twitched once and pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. And Lois, dreaming quietly, turned toward the empty crib next to her bed without waking. Each of them, in their own way, was a part of Stewie's strange, chaotic orbit. And maybe he didn't need to escape them after all. Maybe he just needed to let them in. His eyes fluttered now, not from sadness, not from exhaustion, but from a softness he hadn't known how to carry before. And as he turned from the window, the first threads of dawn brushing faintly along the edges of the sky, he returned to his crib. Not with bitterness, not with mockery, but with the small, powerful dignity of choosing rest. He curled beneath his blanket, pulling Rupert close, and for the first time in what felt like a very long time, there was no internal monologue, no sharp retort, no imaginary broadcast. There was only breath, in and out, slow and even, like the rhythm of the world before words, like a lullaby sung in silence, like surrender, like sleep. And as Stewie drifted, his last conscious thought wasn't about control. It was about presence. He was here, fully, softly, and for tonight, beautifully unarmed.
The house on Spooner Street always looked the same from the outside, square, beige, reliably average. The kind of house no one expected to shelter the chaos, comedy, and quiet revolutions that took place within. And as dawn spilled lazily across Quahog like a soft spill of milk over sleepy countertops, the Griffin home seemed to exhale. Stewie awoke slowly, not with a jolt or a gasp, but with a blink. One eye, then the other, the kind of waking that doesn't mark a new day, but continues the night's journey. Quiet, internal, and seamless. The kind that acknowledges that something shifted while you slept, even if you can't yet name what. He lay in his crib, arms around Rupert, the room untouched and serene. The emotional archive no longer glowed. It simply was a presence, not a performance. It didn't hum, didn't pulse, didn't need to. Like so many things in Stewie's life, its importance had moved from spectacle to symbol, from grandiosity to subtlety. He didn't need to test it anymore, not to decode his fears or simulate old pain or chase forgotten echoes. He had found what he was looking for, not an answer, but an understanding. And that understanding wasn't about the world. It was about himself. Because for all the intelligence he wielded, all the schemes he orchestrated, and all the walls he built, Stewie had finally discovered the one truth that couldn't be mapped or modeled. That vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was a bridge to others, to himself. And once that realization was in him, it couldn't be undone. That morning was different, not in sight or sound, but in texture. His mind felt quieter, not empty, but not frantically full. For a child who had always lived in high alert, ready to dominate, to mock, to outwit, it felt like the difference between floating and flailing. He didn't leap from the crib. He didn't summon Brian or test Lois or declare anything at all. He simply sat there still. And as the sunlight crawled across his nursery walls like a warm secret, Stewie let it happen. Later, he made his way downstairs, tiny feet soft against each step. The house was waking up around him. The familiar sounds, Peter's exaggerated yawns, Meg's door creaking open, like a reluctant confession, Chris asking no one if Pop-Tarts count as breakfast. All of it filtered through him, not as noise, but as music. Imperfect, ridiculous, but unmistakably his. Brian was already in the kitchen nursing a cup of coffee, flipping through a newspaper he barely pretended to care about. When Stewie walked in, the dog glanced up with a tired smile. "Morning, kid." Stewie nodded. His usual sharp retort softened into a quiet morning. No sarcasm, no plot behind it, just the word. Brian's ears twitched slightly, sensing something unspoken. But he didn't press. He just scooted over on the bench, offering space. And Stewie climbed up, legs dangling, silence between them. Not awkward, but companionable. He glanced at the window. A bird hopped across the sill. Outside, the street was alive in its own sleepy way. Mailboxes creaked open, sprinklers hissed, neighbors waved to no one in particular. "I think I'm going to take a break from building things," Stewie said after a long minute. Brian raised a brow. "You mean no more mind control devices? No more reality-shifting portals? No more memory vaults that emotionally cripple you?" A small smile tugged at Stewie's lips. "Something like that." Brian sipped his coffee. "Well, what are you going to do with all that brain power now?" Stewie looked down at his hands. Small, soft, deceptively delicate. "I don't know, just be." It wasn't on a dramatic moment. No music swelled, no sunlight burst through the clouds. But Brian knew instinctively that something had ended. Or, more precisely, something else had begun. Throughout the day, Stewie didn't retreat to his lab. He didn't got obsess over new plans or rehearse cutting remarks. He played blocks with Chris, watched cartoons with Meg without mocking her taste, sat beside Lois in the living room and actually asked, about her day. And when Peter grabbed him for a ridiculous, overly tight bear hug, Stewie didn't protest. He let it happen. Let the warmth of contact settle over him like a blanket. For the first time, he didn't brace himself for ridicule or misunderstanding. He allowed himself to receive, and more importantly, to stay. That evening, long after dinner dishes clattered and sitcom reruns echoed in the background, Stewie found himself on the back porch, the stars beginning to poke through the velvet sky. Brian joined him, tail twitching. "You ever think maybe this is enough?" Stewie asked, voice barely louder than the rustle of the wind. Brian tilted his head. "You mean the chaos? The family? The unending absurdity of life under this roof?" Stewie nodded. Brian chuckled. "I think it has to be. Because if we keep waiting for perfect, we miss the good. And honestly, there's a lot of good here, even if it's covered in fart jokes and bad decisions." The two sat in silence again. And then Stewie said, "I used to think I needed to conquer the world, to be free, but I think maybe I just needed to forgive it." Brian looked at him. "And yourself?" Stewie took a breath, long and measured. "I'm working on that part." The sky deepened into indigo, stars pulsing like memories. And in that space, they both exhaled the past, inhaled the now. Later, as Stewie tucked himself into bed, the room felt less like a lab, less like a war room, and more like what it always should have been, a sanctuary. He looked at Rupert, eyes soft. "We did it, old friend. Not in the way we thought, but we did." Rupert, eternally silent and eternally loyal, leaned into him the way only a stuffed bear could. And Stewie, once a weapon of mass intellect, mass ambition, mass denial, closed his eyes not with resistance but with trust. Not in the world, not even in his family, but in himself. And that was the victory he'd never dared to plan for. Outside, the world spun gently on. Somewhere, versions of him in alternate realities still plotted, still raged, still feared. But this Stewie, our Stewie, had chosen presence, had chosen softness, had chosen sleep. And for now, that was enough. The night settled over Quahog. And Stewie Griffin, finally, peacefully.